Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mists of time to a world where marble gleamed under Mediterranean sun, where the scent of olive oil and wine hung heavy in the warm air, where the footsteps of gods and mortals echoed through cobblestone streets. Imagine Rome, not the ruins you might visit today, but Rome alive, breathing, pulsing with ambition and dreams. Picture the 7 hills crowned with temples, the Forum bustling with merchants and senators, the Tiber flowing like liquid silver beneath ancient bridges. This is where our story begins, in the heart of an empire that believed it would last forever. Tonight, we follow the shadow of one man whose name still whispers through history like wind through cypress trees, a man who loved, conquered, betrayed, and was betrayed. A man who stood at the crossroads between republic and empire, between the old world and the new. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. But before we begin this gentle journey through time, if these whispered tales of the past speak to your soul, consider subscribing to our channel. Leave a comment and tell us what other stories from history's gentle embrace you'd like to hear. Your voice guides these midnight wanderings through time. Now, dim the lights. Let the world fade around you. Close your eyes and simply listen. Let history become a dream, and let Caesar's story unfold like moonlight on water. The year is 100 BCE. Rome breathes, and in a modest house on the Subura, the crowded, noisy district where common people lived their daily struggles, a child draws his first breath under stars that have watched empires rise and fall. The boy from the Subura had become the conqueror of Gaul. But his greatest test still lay ahead, waiting in the marble halls of Rome, where his enemies had spent 8 years sharpening their knives and preparing to teach him that some ambitions come at a price that no man should be willing to pay. In the soft pre-dawn darkness of Rome, when the city still slept beneath a blanket of stars, Aurelia Caesar felt the first stirrings of life within her womb. The year was 100 BCE, and the world was vast and unknowing of what was to come. Outside her window, the narrow streets of the Subura district lay quiet, a rare moment of peace in Rome's most crowded quarter, where merchants, craftsmen, and the working souls of the empire made their humble homes. The house was modest, built of brick and timber, its walls worn smooth by countless hands. Here, among the common people, far from the marble palaces of the Palatine Hill, a child would be born who would one day make the very foundations of the earth tremble. But on this night he was simply a baby, drawing breath for the first time, his small fists clenched against the cool air, his eyes, those eyes that would one day gaze upon Gaul, Egypt, and Britain, blinking in the gentle lamplight. They named him Gaius Julius Caesar, after his father and the long line of Caesars who had served Rome with quiet dignity. His family claimed descent from Venus herself, the goddess of love and beauty, through her son Aeneas, the legendary founder of the Roman people. It was a noble lineage, though not a wealthy one. The Caesars were patricians by blood but lived among the plebs by circumstance, a position that would shape young Gaius in ways his parents could never imagine. Listen. Can you hear the sounds of that long-ago morning? The soft murmur of Aurelia's voice as she holds her newborn son whispering prayers to Venus for his protection. The distant call of early vendors beginning their rounds through the streets. The gentle lowing of cattle being driven to market. The world was so much quieter then, so much slower. Time moved like honey, thick and golden, and a single lifetime could contain entire worlds of experience. As baby Gaius grew into boyhood, Rome itself was growing, changing, stretching its arms across the Mediterranean like a great octopus. The city was a contradiction, ancient traditions wrapped around new ambitions, republican ideals struggling against imperial hunger. In the Forum, senators debated in togas that had been worn by their grandfathers, while in the streets, slaves from a dozen conquered nations spoke in tongues that had never before been heard within Rome's walls. Young Caesar would wander these streets with wide, curious eyes. Picture him as a boy of 7 or 8, his dark hair catching the golden afternoon light as he explores the markets near his home. The Subura was alive with humanity, bakers kneading dough in the pre-dawn darkness, fullers washing clothes in giant vats of urine and clay, prostitutes calling from doorways, children playing with hoops and sticks in whatever space they could find between the cartwheels and the crowds. This was not the Rome of marble statues and grand processions. This was the Rome of sweat and struggle, of dreams deferred and hopes whispered in the darkness. And it was here, among the common people, that Caesar learned his first lessons about power. Not the power of birth or wealth, but the power of words, of presence, of making oneself heard above the crowd. His mother Aurelia was his first teacher, a woman of sharp intelligence and fiercer ambition. She would sit with him in their small garden as the sun set behind the 7 hills, teaching him to read and write, to speak with clarity and purpose. Words, she would tell him, her voice soft but insistent, are the only weapons that never break, the only shields that never rust. Learn to use them well, my son, and you will never be powerless. In the evenings, when the day's heat had faded and the narrow streets began to cool, Caesar's father would return from his modest duties as a minor magistrate. He was a kind man, honest but unremarkable, content with his small role in the great machinery of Rome. But young Gaius would watch him with growing impatience, sensing, even as a child, that the world held possibilities his father had never dared to imagine. The boy's education began in earnest when he turned 7. Like all Roman children of good family, he was sent to a grammaticus, a teacher who would instruct him in reading, writing, and the basics of rhetoric. But Caesar's real education happened in the streets and forums of Rome itself. He would slip away from his lessons whenever possible, drawn like a moth to the flame of political life. Picture him standing at the edge of the Forum Romanum on a day when the Senate was in session. The great square buzzed with activity, merchants hawking their wares, citizens gathering to hear news and gossip, slaves hurrying on errands for their masters. And there in the Curia, behind doors of polished bronze, the fate of nations was being decided by men in white togas, their voices echoing in chambers that had heard the wisdom of Cicero and the thunder of Cato. Young Caesar would press close to those doors, straining to catch fragments of the debates within. Even as a boy, he understood that this was where real power lived, not in the sword or the purse, but in the ability to sway minds, to move hearts, to turn the tide of opinion with nothing but words and will. But childhood in Rome was shadowed by violence, as it had always been. The boy Caesar lived through years when the city ran red with blood, when political disagreements were settled with daggers in the Forum, when heads were displayed on pikes as warnings to those who dared oppose the powerful. The social war raged across Italy, as Rome's allies demanded the citizenship they had earned with their blood. Marius and Sulla fought their bitter civil wars, filling the streets with soldiers and the air with the screams of the dying. Through it all, young Caesar watched and learned. He saw how quickly fortune could change, how the mighty could fall and the humble could rise. He witnessed the power of the mob, the fickleness of popular opinion, the deadly dance between ambition and survival that defined Roman political life. These were lessons no teacher could provide, written not in scrolls, but in blood and tears. As he grew from boy to youth, Caesar began to show the qualities that would define his life. He was tall for his age, with dark, intelligent eyes and a way of moving that suggested coiled energy, like a panther waiting to spring. He was charming, even as a child, able to win over adults with his quick wit and easy smile. But there was something else there too, something his mother Aurelia recognized with a mixture of pride and fear, an ambition so vast it seemed to swallow light like a black star. On quiet evenings, when the family gathered for their simple meal of bread, olives, and watered wine, Caesar would regale them with stories of his day, the speeches he had heard, the people he had met, the glimpses he had caught of the great game of politics. His eyes would shine as he spoke of the future, of the things he would do when he was grown, of the changes he would make in the world. "Be careful, my son," his father would warn gently. Rome has little patience for those who reach too high too quickly. But young Caesar would only smile, that same smile that would one day charm Cleopatra and terrify senators. "Rome," he would reply, "has never seen anyone like me." And in the gathering dusk, As oil lamps flickered to life across the 7 hills and the sounds of the city settled into the gentle rhythm of evening, a destiny was taking shape. In the narrow streets of the Subura, among the common people he would never forget, the future master of the world was learning to dream. The temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, gleamed like a jewel atop the Capitoline Hill, its marble columns catching the first rays of dawn. A 16-year-old Caesar climbed the ancient steps. His toga, newly donned in the ceremony that marked his passage from boy to man, felt strange and heavy on his shoulders, a weight that seemed to embody all the responsibilities and possibilities that lay ahead. It was the year 84 BCE, and Rome trembled beneath the iron fist of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the dictator who had returned from the East with legions hardened by war and a heart turned to stone by years of civil conflict. The city had grown quiet under his rule, the kind of silence that comes not from peace but from fear, when words are weighed before they are spoken and glances are carefully guarded. Young Caesar paused at the temple's entrance, breathing in the sharp scent of incense and sacrifice that always hung in the air around Rome's sacred places. Before him stretched the city of his birth, 7 hills crowned with temples and palaces, connected by streets that carried the hopes and dreams of 1 million souls. But something had changed in the Rome of his boyhood. The laughter seemed forced now, the conversations muted, the very air heavy with unspoken dangers. As he entered the temple to offer prayers for his future, Caesar could not have known that within months his life would hang by the thinnest of threads, suspended over an abyss that had already swallowed so many of Rome's brightest suns. The marriage came first, arranged by families who still believed in the old ways, in alliances sealed with gold and blessed by the gods. Her name was Cassutia, a girl from a wealthy plebeian family, chosen not for love but for the dowry she would bring and the connections her relatives could provide. Picture them standing together in the atrium of her father's house, 2 young people, barely more than children, bound by contracts they had not written and promises they barely understood. Caesar, even at 16, possessed a presence that drew eyes and held attention. He was tall and lean, with the kind of sharp-featured handsomeness that would age well, and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets even when he was merely listening to conversations about household accounts or the price of grain. Cassutia was pretty in the conventional way, fair-skinned with carefully arranged hair, and the slightly nervous smile of a girl who had been raised to be ornamental rather than essential. But fate, that cruel playwright who scripted the dramas of Roman life, had different plans entirely. The summons came on a morning when autumn mist hung low over the Tiber, transforming the familiar city into something dreamlike and strange. Caesar was called to appear before Sulla himself, the man who had reshared Rome in his own image, who collected enemies' heads like trophies and ruled through fear disguised as justice. Can you picture that walk through the streets of Rome? The young man's sandals clicking against wet stones, his breath visible in the cool air, his mind racing through possibilities both terrible and wonderful. Citizens moved aside as he passed, not from respect but from the instinct that recognized danger, the way animals scatter before a storm. Sulla's villa on the Palatine Hill rose like a monument to conquest, its walls adorned with the spoils of eastern campaigns, golden shields, silver statues, tapestries woven with threads that caught the light like captured stars. The dictator himself sat in a room designed to intimidate, surrounded by the symbols of his power and the shadows of those who had dared to oppose him. He was not a large man physically, but presence filled the space around him like the heat from a forge. His eyes, pale and cold as winter sky, fixed on the young Caesar with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who had ordered the deaths of thousands and slept peacefully afterward. "Your marriage to Cassutia will not proceed," Sulla announced, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "You will marry Cornelia instead, Cinna's daughter." The room seemed to spin around Caesar. Lucius Cornelius Cinna had been Sulla's bitter enemy, one of the populares who had stood with Marius against the Optimates. To marry Cinna's daughter now, in the aftermath of Sulla's victory, would be to bind himself to the losing side, to wear their defeat like a chain around his neck. But refusal was not an option. In Sulla's Rome, one did not argue with the dictator's wishes. One simply obeyed and hoped to survive long enough to see another dawn. And so, in a ceremony shadowed by political necessity rather than blessed by love, Caesar married Cornelia. She was young, barely 15, with dark hair that fell like water down her back and eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. Unlike his first betrothed, there was steel beneath her gentle exterior, the kind of strength that comes from growing up in a household where politics was a matter of life and death. Picture their wedding night in a house that felt more like a trap than a home. Two young people bound together by forces beyond their control, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to shift and change with each passing day. But perhaps, just perhaps, in that uncertainty, something real began to grow between them. Not the grand passion of poets, but something steadier and more precious. Understanding, companionship, the beginning of a partnership that would weather storms neither could yet imagine. For a brief time, it seemed as though Caesar might find happiness in the quiet life of a minor patrician. He took up residence in the Subura, not far from his childhood home, and began the slow process of building a career within the established order. He served as a priest of Jupiter, the Flamen Dialis, a position that brought honor but also restrictions. The priest could not touch iron, could not see a dead body, could not spend a night outside Rome. It was a role designed for someone content to serve the gods rather than conquer the world. But contentment was not in Caesar's nature. Even as he performed his religious duties with scrupulous care, his eyes remained fixed on the larger game being played in the Forum and the Senate House. He watched as Sulla's supporters divided the spoils of victory among themselves, as new men rose to power on the backs of the old family's destruction, as Rome itself seemed to settle into a new and harsher rhythm. Then came the day that changed everything. The day when messengers arrived at Caesar's door with news that would force him to choose between safety and principle, between life and honor. Sulla had issued new orders. The prescription lists, those terrible catalogues of the condemned, were being updated. Names were being added of those who had shown insufficient loyalty to the new regime, and Caesar's name, whispered sources suggested, was among those being considered for inclusion. The reason was simple. His marriage to Cornelia had made him suspect. Her father's memory still carried the taint of opposition, and in Sulla's Rome, guilt by association was often enough to warrant a death sentence. Unless Caesar could prove his loyalty in some dramatic fashion, unless he could sacrifice his wife to save his own life, he would join the growing list of those who had vanished into the darkness of political retribution. Picture Caesar on the night when this ultimatum reached him, standing in the small garden behind his house with Cornelia beside him. The air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, and somewhere in the distance, a lyre played a gentle melody that seemed to mock the terror of their situation. She was not yet 18, this girl who had become his anchor in a world gone mad, and now he was being asked to cast her aside like a broken sandal. "Divorce me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears that traced silver lines down her cheeks. "Save yourself, Gaius. I understand." But Caesar, looking into her eyes, found something there that he had not expected. Not just love, though that was present, but respect. She believed in him, believed that he was capable of greatness, even when that belief might cost them both their lives. "No," he said, the word falling between them like a covenant. "We face this together, whatever comes." And so began Caesar's first great gamble, the first of many times he would stake everything on a single roll of fortune's dice. Rather than submit to Sulla's demand, rather than purchase safety with betrayal, he chose exile. Under cover of darkness, with only a few loyal servants and the clothes on their backs, Caesar and Cornelia fled Rome. The journey south was a nightmare of muddy roads and sleepless nights, of starting at every sound and seeing enemies in every shadow. They traveled like common refugees, disguised as merchants or pilgrims, staying in roadside inns where the wine was sour and the beds crawled with vermin. For a young man who had been raised to expect comfort and respect, It was a harsh introduction to the realities of powerlessness, but perhaps those weeks of flight taught Caesar lessons more valuable than any his tutors had provided. He learned what it meant to depend entirely on his own resources, to make decisions when every choice carried mortal consequences, to lead when leadership might mean death for those who followed him. And he learned, most importantly, that he could endure, that the soft young patrician from the Subura contained reserves of strength he had never suspected. They found refuge eventually in the mountains of Sabina, in a village so small it had no name, where Caesar's family had distant connections and old favors could still be called upon. There, in a farmhouse that seemed to exist outside of time, they waited while Rome burned with purges and their fate hung in the balance. Picture those long winter nights, with snow falling soft as whispers outside their window and a fire crackling on the modest hearth. Caesar and Cornelia, still little more than children themselves, huddled together against the cold and the uncertainty, talking in hushed voices about the future they might never see. In those quiet hours, bonds were forged between them that would last until death and perhaps beyond. Word came with the spring thaw. Sulla's mother-in-law and other influential women had interceded on Caesar's behalf, arguing that he was too young to pose any real threat, too inexperienced to be worth the effort of elimination. The dictator, perhaps weary of bloodshed or simply indifferent to one more minor patrician, agreed to let the matter drop. But his pardon came with a warning that Caesar would carry with him for the rest of his life. In this young man I see many Mariuses. It was meant as a threat, a reminder that Sulla's clemency could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. But Caesar, hearing those words repeated by nervous friends, felt something entirely different. Recognition, perhaps, or prophecy. Marius had been a giant who strode across the stage of Roman history like a force of nature. If Sulla saw something of Marius in the young exile from the Subura, then perhaps the future held possibilities even grander than Caesar had dared to imagine. And so, as spring returned to Rome and the city began to heal from the wounds of civil war, Caesar and Cornelia made their way home. They walked through gates they had not been certain they would ever see again, breathed air that had once seemed poisoned with danger, looked up at familiar hills with eyes that had learned to see the world differently. Caesar was 21 now, no longer a boy playing at being a man, but a survivor who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. The experience had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. There was a new steadiness in his gaze, a new careful quality to his words, a new awareness of how quickly fortune could turn from friend to enemy. But most importantly, he had learned that he could choose principle over safety, honor over survival, and live to tell the tale. It was a lesson that would shape every decision he made in the years to come, a foundation of moral courage upon which he would build an empire. The young man who returned to Rome in the spring of 82 BCE was still Caesar, still ambitious, still charming, still blessed with the kind of presence that made others want to follow him. But now he carried something else as well, the knowledge that he had been tested and not found wanting, that when the moment of choice arrived, he had proven himself worthy of the destiny he had always claimed. In the narrow streets of the Subura, among the people who had watched him grow from boy to man, Caesar began to plan his next move. The game of Roman politics was far from over, and he intended to play it better than anyone who had come before. After all, Sulla himself had said it. In young Caesar there were many Mariuses waiting to be born. The ship creaked and groaned as it cut through the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean, carrying its precious cargo of young Roman nobles toward the ancient island of Rhodes. Among them, 24-year-old Caesar stood at the rail, watching the sun set behind them like a dying ember, painting the waves in shades of gold and crimson that would have made the poets weep. He was traveling to study rhetoric under Apollonius Molon, the most celebrated teacher of oratory in the ancient world. But fate, that master dramatist who seemed to take particular pleasure in Caesar's story, had written a different lesson entirely, one that would be delivered not in the comfortable halls of academia, but on the rolling deck of a pirate ship, under circumstances that would have broken a lesser man and forged Caesar into something far more dangerous than even he had imagined. Picture him in those moments before the attack, his dark hair whipping in the sea breeze, his eyes fixed on the horizon with the kind of intensity that had marked him since childhood. At 24, Caesar had already buried his beloved Cornelia, taken by childbirth fever while still in the bloom of her youth, and felt the first sharp taste of real loss. The grief had changed him, carved new depths into his character, like a sculptor's chisel working marble. Where once there had been the eager confidence of youth, now there was something harder, more focused, tempered by sorrow into an instrument of terrible precision. The pirates came at dawn, emerging from the morning mist like phantoms given flesh. Their ships were small and fast, built for speed rather than comfort, manned by men who had learned to read the sea like a familiar scroll. These were not the romantic brigands of later stories, but professionals in the business of violence and ransom, practitioners of an art that had flourished in the power vacuum left by Rome's civil wars. The attack itself was swift and efficient. No heroic last stands, no dramatic speeches, simply the sudden appearance of armed men swarming over the rails while most passengers still struggled to shake sleep from their eyes. Caesar found himself dragged from his cabin, wrists bound with rope that bit into his skin, thrown onto a pile of other captives like so much valuable cargo. But even in that moment of helplessness, something in Caesar's bearing marked him as different. Perhaps it was the way he held himself, straight-backed despite his bonds, or the calm assessment in his dark eyes as he studied his captors. Whatever it was, the pirate captain, a scarred veteran named Polygonius, recognized quality when he saw it. "This one," he said in accented Latin, pointing at Caesar with a weathered finger, "is worth more than the others combined." They were taken to a small island off the coast of Asia Minor, one of dozens of rocky havens where pirates had established their temporary kingdoms. The place had no proper name. The locals called it simply the Pirates' Rock, but it would become Caesar's university for the next 38 days, a classroom where he would learn lessons no traditional education could provide. The ransom demand was 20 talents of silver, a substantial sum but not extraordinary for a young patrician with family connections. Caesar listened to the figure with the same attention he might have given to a merchant's price for grain, then did something that shocked his captors into momentary silence. He laughed. Not the nervous laughter of fear or the bitter laughter of despair, but genuine amusement, as if he had just heard a particularly clever joke at a dinner party. 20 talents, he said, still chuckling. "My dear Polygonius, you clearly don't know who you've captured. I am worth at least 50 talents. I'm almost insulted by your lack of ambition." The pirates stared at him, uncertain whether they were dealing with a madman or someone so supremely confident that he could negotiate his own ransom upward. But Caesar's logic was unassailable. A higher ransom would enhance his reputation, mark him as a person of genuine importance rather than just another minor noble. It was his first taste of the principle that would guide much of his later career. If you're going to do something, do it so grandly that the world has no choice but to take notice. And so began one of the strangest periods of captivity in recorded history. Rather than cowering in chains or plotting desperate escapes, Caesar seemed to settle into the pirate settlement as if he were a guest at a particularly rustic villa. He chatted with his guards, learned their names and stories, showed genuine interest in their lives and backgrounds. Within days, he had somehow established himself not as a prisoner, but as the most entertaining person on the island. Picture the scene: a rocky outcrop in the middle of the sea, populated by some of the most dangerous men in the Mediterranean, and at its center, a young Roman aristocrat holding court like a philosopher in the agora. Caesar would spend his days composing poetry and speeches, testing them out on his captive audience, accepting their critiques with the same grace he might have shown to his tutors in Rome. "That ending needs work," one grizzled pirate might say, after Caesar finished reciting a particularly elaborate piece about the glory of conquest. "You're absolutely right," Caesar would reply thoughtfully. "The rhythm falls apart in the final stanza. Let me try this instead." But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of those 38 days was how Caesar gradually, almost imperceptibly, began to shift the dynamic of power on the island. Through sheer force of personality, he transformed himself from prisoner to something approaching a leader. Pirates who had planned to spend their time drinking and gambling instead found themselves engaged in discussions of philosophy and politics. Men who had never opened a scroll were suddenly interested in poetry. The atmosphere of the settlement changed, became more civilized, more Roman. Caesar even organized entertainment for his captors, staging mock trials and dramatic performances, always casting himself in the leading role. It was during one of these theatrical presentations that he made a promise that would echo through the years to come. Standing before his audience of pirates and cutthroats, dressed in a toga fashioned from a ship's sail, Caesar delivered a speech about justice and retribution that was both performance and prophecy. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying across the water with the clarity of a temple bell, "when I am free, and I will be free, I promise you this: I will return. Not in anger, for you have treated me well, but in duty. The law demands justice, and I am a servant of Roman law. When I come back, it will be with ships and soldiers, and though I bear you no personal malice, I will see you all crucified." The pirates laughed, taking it as part of the performance. But there was something in Caesar's eyes, a quality of absolute certainty, that should have given them pause. This was not a threat born of wounded pride or temporary fury. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm assurance of someone describing the phases of the moon or the turning of the seasons. The ransom, when it finally arrived, came not just from Caesar's family, but from cities throughout Asia Minor, who had heard of the young Roman's captivity. 50 talents of silver, more wealth than most people would see in a lifetime, carried in heavily guarded ships that appeared on the horizon like a constellation of hope. The negotiations for his release were conducted with all the formality of a diplomatic treaty. Caesar insisted on being allowed to address his captors one final time, and what he said in those moments would become legend among the pirates of the Eastern Mediterranean. "You have shown me courtesy," he began, standing on the deck of Polygonius's ship with the ransom chests at his feet. "You have given me food and shelter, protection from the elements, and most valuable of all, an education in the nature of power that no school could provide. For this, I am genuinely grateful." He paused, letting his words settle over the assembled pirates like morning mist over calm water. "But gratitude and justice are not the same thing. You are criminals, and crimes must be punished. When I return, not if, but when, I will remember your kindness. Your deaths will be swift and merciful. This I promise you as a Roman and as a man." And then he was gone, rowed away to freedom on a boat that grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the vast expanse of the sea. But Caesar's word was his bond, forged in the same fires that had shaped his character through loss and exile. Within months, he had returned to the region as a young magistrate with imperium, the legal authority to command troops and impose Rome's will. He requisitioned ships from the Roman fleet at Miletus, recruited soldiers from Roman settlements throughout Asia Minor, and set sail for the pirates' stronghold with the inexorable patience of a gathering storm. The assault on the island was swift and decisive. The pirates, who had grown complacent during their months of easy success, found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy who knew their strengths and weaknesses as intimately as he knew his own. Caesar had studied them during his captivity, learned their patterns and habits, observed their defenses with the eye of a military engineer. Most of the pirates were taken alive, exactly as Caesar had planned. He could have had them executed immediately. His authority as a Roman magistrate would have justified summary punishment for crimes against Roman citizens. But Caesar remembered his promise, and his word, once given, was sacred as temple vows. The captives were transported to Pergamon, where they were formally tried before a proper Roman court. The proceedings were swift but fair, conducted according to law rather than vengeance. When the inevitable guilty verdicts were pronounced, Caesar personally supervised the executions, ensuring that each man's death was as quick and painless as possible. Polygonius, the pirate captain, was saved for last. As he was led to his cross, he looked up at Caesar with something that might have been respect. "You kept your promise," he said simply. "I told you I would," Caesar replied. Then, more quietly, so that only the pirate could hear, "You taught me things about leadership that I could never have learned in Rome. For that lesson, you have my thanks. But the law is the law." The pirate captain died as he had lived, without complaint, accepting his fate with the stoicism of a professional who understood that every game eventually ends. But his death marked more than just the end of one criminal enterprise. It announced to the world that a new player had entered the great game of Roman politics, someone who combined mercy with ruthlessness, courtesy with implacable will. Word of Caesar's handling of the pirate affair spread quickly through the complex network of gossip and rumor that connected every corner of the Roman world. Here was a young man who could negotiate with criminals as easily as he conversed with philosophers, who could organize a military campaign with the same skill he brought to composing poetry, who kept his promises whether they were made to friends or enemies. The story reached Rhodes, where Apollonius Molon waited to teach rhetoric to his newest student. When Caesar finally arrived at the great teacher's academy, months later than planned, he brought with him a reputation that preceded him like morning shadows stretching across marble floors. "So," the old master said, looking up from his scrolls as Caesar entered the famous lecture hall, "you are the young Roman who turned pirates into an audience and captivity into a classroom." Caesar smiled, the same enigmatic expression that had charmed and puzzled observers since his childhood. "I am a student, Master Apollonius. I come to learn the arts of persuasion." "It seems," the teacher replied dryly, "that you have already begun your education." And indeed he had. The months that followed on Rhodes were spent in formal study of rhetoric and oratory, learning the techniques that had been developed by generations of Greek masters. Caesar proved to be an exceptional student, his mind sharp as a blade and twice as flexible. He mastered the classical forms, studied the great speeches of history, practiced the gestures and modulations of voice that could move audiences to tears or rage. But the real lessons had already been learned on a pirate-infested rock in the middle of the sea, where a young Roman had discovered that leadership was not about commanding obedience, but about inspiring it. That true power came not from force, but from the ability to make others want to follow you into whatever darkness lay ahead. When Caesar finally returned to Rome in 69 BCE, he carried with him more than just the formal credentials of a Rhodes-educated orator. He brought the confidence of someone who had been tested in ways that could not be simulated in schools or academies, who had learned to read men's hearts as easily as he read Greek poetry, who understood that the greatest victories were won not through strength, but through the patient application of intelligence, charm, and absolute certainty of purpose. The young man who walked through Rome's gates that autumn day was still recognizably the same person who had fled Sulla's anger years before. But now there was something new in his bearing, a quality that made people turn their heads as he passed, that suggested depths of capability they had not previously suspected. Caesar was 31 years old, no longer young by Roman standards, but not yet at the height of his powers. The great deeds that would make his name immortal still lay ahead of him, waiting to be born from the marriage of opportunity and preparation. But the foundation had been laid in the most unlikely of classrooms, among the most dangerous of teachers, in circumstances that would have broken a lesser man and forged him into something far more dangerous than Rome had ever seen. The Forum Romanum in the hour before dawn was a place of shadows and whispers, where ambition stalked through marble corridors like a hungry ghost seeking flesh to inhabit. Here, in the heart of the empire, where every stone had witnessed triumph and tragedy in equal measure, Caesar began his careful ascent up the cursus honorum, the ladder of offices that every Roman politician must climb on his journey toward power. Picture him in those early morning hours, moving through the half-light like a man walking through his own destiny. At 33, Caesar possessed a physical presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Tall and lean, with the kind of sharp-featured elegance that suggested both aristocratic breeding and careful self-discipline. His dark hair was beginning to thin at the temples, a fact that troubled him more than he cared to admit, but his eyes remained as penetrating as ever, missing nothing, forgetting less. The year was 65 BCE, and Caesar held the office of aedile, one of the junior magistracies responsible for the city's infrastructure, markets, and public entertainment. It was not a glamorous position by traditional standards, dealing as it did with sewers and street maintenance, with the price of grain and the regulation of taverns. But Caesar understood what many of his contemporaries did not, that in Rome, the man who controlled the bread and circuses controlled the hearts of the people, and so he transformed what should have been a mundane administrative role into something approaching theatre. Where previous aediles had provided adequate games, Caesar staged spectacles that left audiences breathless with wonder. Where others had maintained basic services, he expanded and improved them until the common citizens began to speak of him with something approaching reverence. Listen. Can you hear the roar of the crowd as gladiators clash in the arena Caesar had commissioned? The sound echoes across the centuries like thunder, carrying with it the voices of tens of thousands of Romans who had never seen such magnificence, such attention to their desires and needs. Caesar spared no expense, borrowing vast sums to finance games that would be remembered for generations. But the true masterstroke was not in the grandeur of the spectacles themselves, but in the way Caesar presented them, not as the gifts of a wealthy patron to his inferiors, but as the rightful inheritance of Roman citizens from their republic. He stood before the crowds not as a benefactor, but as a servant, speaking to them with the same respect he might have shown to senators, making them feel not like subjects, but like partners in the great enterprise of Roman civilization. Citizens of Rome, his voice would ring across the packed amphitheater, carrying clearly to the highest seats where the poorest spectators strained to hear, "These games are not my gift to you. They are your birthright as sons and daughters of the eternal city. I am merely the instrument through which your city honors itself." It was a subtle revolution, this reframing of the relationship between ruler and ruled, but its effects rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The people began to see Caesar not just as another ambitious politician, but as someone who understood them, who valued their opinions and sought their approval, not from calculation, but from genuine respect. Meanwhile, in the more exclusive circles of Roman society, Caesar was weaving a different kind of magic. His house in the Subura became a gathering place for the ambitious, the talented, and the discontented, a salon where poets rubbed shoulders with generals, where philosophers debated with merchants, where the rigid hierarchies of traditional Roman society seemed to dissolve into something more fluid and promising. Marcus Licinius Crassus was a frequent visitor, the richest man in Rome, drawn by Caesar's combination of charm and capability. Picture these two sitting in Caesar's modest garden as the sun set behind the 7 hills, the older man's calculating eyes studying the younger with the intensity of a jeweler examining a particularly promising stone. "You spend too much," Crassus would say, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had turned money into an art form. "These games, these improvements, you're bleeding silver like a stuck pig." Caesar would smile, that same enigmatic expression that had puzzled observers since his youth. "Money is a tool, Marcus, not a treasure to be hoarded. I invest in something far more valuable than gold." "And what is that?" "Memory. When Romans speak my name, I want them to remember not what I took from them, but what I gave. A man who is remembered with gratitude is never truly poor." It was during this period that Caesar made one of the most audacious political moves of his career, his campaign for the position of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome's state religion. The office was traditionally held by elderly statesmen at the end of distinguished careers, men whose claims to honor were written in years of service and accumulated dignity. Caesar was 37 years old, young by Roman standards, with a political resume that, while impressive, hardly qualified him for such an exalted position. His opponents included Quintus Lutatius Catulus and Publius Servilius Vatia, both former consuls with impeccable credentials and the kind of gravitas that Romans associated with religious authority. But Caesar had learned lessons about power that his opponents had never grasped. While they campaigned in the traditional manner, making speeches to the Senate, calling upon old friendships and family connections, Caesar took his case directly to the people. Picture him in the narrow streets of the Subura, moving through markets and taverns like a man coming home after a long journey. He knew these places intimately, had grown up among the bakers and fullers, the freedmen and slaves who made up the vast majority of Rome's population. And they knew him, not as a distant figure in a white toga, but as someone who had shared their struggles, who understood what it meant to worry about the price of bread and the security of employment. The chief priest should be someone who serves all Romans, he would say, standing in the doorway of a workshop where craftsmen paused in their labor to listen. Not just those who can afford to make generous donations to the temples. It was a message perfectly calibrated to appeal to people who had always felt excluded from the higher mysteries of Roman religion, who saw the priesthood as another preserve of the wealthy and well-connected. Caesar promised them something different, a chief priest who would remember that the gods belonged to everyone, not just the elite. The campaign was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Where traditional religious elections were sedate affairs, conducted largely behind closed doors, Caesar's bid for the pontificate became a popular movement. Citizens who had never paid attention to priestly politics suddenly found themselves debating the merits of different candidates, arguing in taverns and bathhouses about the proper role of religion in public life. On the morning of the election, Caesar stood before his bathroom mirror and made a promise that would become legend among those who knew him best. Looking at his reflection, still handsome despite the advancing years, still possessed of that magnetic presence that drew followers like moths to flame, he spoke words that his slave would later repeat to historians. "Today," he said quietly, "I either return home as Pontifex Maximus, or I do not return home at all." It was not mere rhetoric. Caesar had borrowed so heavily to finance his campaign, had made so many promises to so many different people, that failure would mean not just political defeat, but complete ruin. Exile, disgrace, perhaps even death at the hands of creditors who had expected their investments to pay dividends in political favor. The voting took place in the Campus Martius, that great open field beyond the city walls, where Romans gathered to exercise their most sacred right as citizens. Thousands crowded into the enclosure, their voices rising like the sound of distant thunder, as they cast their ballots in an election that everyone understood was about more than just religious authority. Caesar voted early, then withdrew to wait with the terrible patience of a gambler who has staked everything on a single throw of the dice. Around him, his supporters maintained a careful optimism, but he could see the worry in their eyes, the calculations of those preparing to distance themselves from a falling star. When the results were announced, the silence that followed was so complete that those present later swore they could hear individual heartbeats in the crowd. Then, like a dam bursting, came the roar of celebration from Caesar's supporters, the shocked murmurs of his opponents, the beginning of a realization that something fundamental had changed in the balance of Roman politics. Caesar had won, and won decisively. The young patrician from the Subura had defeated not just his opponents but the entire established order, proving that in the new Rome, talent and popular appeal could triumph over tradition and connections. That night, as Pontifex Maximus elect, Caesar stood once again in his garden, but now the space seemed transformed by possibility rather than constrained by circumstance. The position brought with it not just religious authority, but political influence, social status, and most importantly, the kind of legitimacy that could serve as a foundation for even greater ambitions. Crassus arrived shortly after the official announcement, his shrewd face wearing an expression that might have been admiration or concern. Possibly both. "Well," the richest man in Rome said simply, "you've certainly made an impression." Caesar smiled, but there was something different in his expression now, a quality of settled purpose that had not been there before. "The people of Rome have honored me with their trust. I intend to prove worthy of it. And your debts will be paid. Everything I have borrowed was an investment in this moment, and investments, when properly managed, always return more than they cost. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Caesar's election as Pontifex Maximus was not the office itself, but what it revealed about the changing nature of Roman politics. The old ways, the careful advancement through established channels, the respect for tradition and hierarchy, were giving way to something more fluid and dangerous. Caesar had shown that a man with sufficient audacity could leap over the careful steps of the cursus honorum, could appeal directly to the people over the heads of the Senate, could transform a religious election into a popular referendum on the future direction of the state. It was a lesson that would not be lost on other ambitious men, and in the years to come, the precedent Caesar had set would inspire imitators and rivals who would push the boundaries of acceptable political behavior even further. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of his victory, Caesar was content to savor the moment and plan his next move. The pontificate was a prize in itself, but it was also a stepping stone to greater things. The consulship, the highest office in the Roman state, remained his ultimate goal, and now, with the authority of chief priest behind him, that goal seemed not just possible, but inevitable. As the night deepened and his visitors departed one by one, Caesar remained in his garden, gazing up at stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of dreams. Somewhere in that vast darkness lay the future he had been building toward since childhood, when he had first heard the voices of senators echoing through the bronze doors of the Curia. He was 40 years old now, no longer young but still in the prime of his abilities. Behind him lay a trail of calculated risks and careful victories, of lessons learned and debts incurred. Ahead stretched possibilities so grand they made his earlier ambitions seem like children's games. The boy who had once pressed his ear to the doors of the Senate House was gone, replaced by a man who would soon force those same doors to open at his command. The transformation was not yet complete. There were still offices to win, rivals to defeat, worlds to conquer. But on this night, as Rome slept beneath its blanket of stars and the new Pontifex Maximus planned his next campaign, the future seemed to whisper his name with something very much like inevitability. In the dying light of a Roman evening, 3 men sat in a private room above a wine shop near the Campus Martius, their voices low and their purpose hidden from the world beyond the shuttered windows. The year was 60 BCE, and history was being written not in the marble halls of the Senate House, but in this modest chamber where ambition had learned to wear the mask of friendship. Caesar, now 40 years old and freshly returned from his governorship in Hispania Ulteria, studied his companions with the careful attention of a general surveying a battlefield. To his left sat Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose wealth had bought him influence but not the respect he craved. To his right lounged Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, the great general whose victories in the East had made him the most celebrated military hero of his generation. 3 men, each powerful in his own sphere, each frustrated by the limitations that Rome's traditional system imposed upon individual ambition. Together, they were about to forge an alliance that would reshape the world, though none of them, in that smoky room filled with the scent of wine and conspiracy, could have foreseen how completely it would transform not just Rome, but the very nature of human civilization. Picture Crassus as he was that evening, a man in his 60s, with the kind of soft features that suggested a life of comfort, but eyes that missed nothing of value. His fingers, heavy with rings that could have fed a legion for a month, drummed impatiently against the wooden table as he outlined his grievances against the Senate's obstruction of his business interests. "They treat me like a moneylender," he was saying, his voice carrying the bitter edge of a man who had never quite achieved the status he felt his wealth deserved. "My gold finances their wars, my investments fund their monuments, my loans keep their families fed. But when I seek recognition, when I ask for honors befitting my contributions, they speak of me as though I were some barbarian merchant selling trinkets in the market." Pompey, by contrast, seemed to fill the room with his presence even while sitting motionless. At 45, he remained impressively physical, broad-shouldered and strong-jawed, with the kind of commanding bearing that made men instinctively step aside when he passed. but there was frustration in his blue eyes, the irritation of a man accustomed to decisive action who found himself trapped in the endless debates and procedural delays of civilian politics. "The Senate promises everything and delivers nothing," Pompey growled, his massive hands gesturing toward the distant capital where his enemies plotted against him. "I conquered the East, brought more territory under Roman rule than any general since Scipio, filled the treasury with enough gold to finance a dozen campaigns, and what do I have to show for it? Months of argument about my veterans' land grants, weeks of debate over my acta, endless discussion about honors that should have been voted the day I returned to Rome." Caesar listened to both men with the focused attention of someone who understood that this moment, this convergence of grievances and opportunities, might never come again. At 40, he was the youngest of the three, but his recent successes in Spain had proven his capabilities as both administrator and commander. More importantly, his election as consul for the following year gave him something his companions lacked: immediate access to legitimate power. "My friends," Caesar said finally, his voice cutting through their complaints with quiet authority, "we each possess something the others need. Marcus, your wealth can finance great enterprises. Pompey, your military reputation commands respect throughout the empire. I have the consulship, with all the legal authority that office provides. Separately, we are constrained by tradition, hobbled by enemies, frustrated by a system designed to prevent any individual from achieving greatness. Together," he let the word hang in the air like incense, sweet with possibility, "together we could accomplish things that would make our names immortal." What followed was not a negotiation in any traditional sense, but something more like the careful choreography of a dance, whose steps had been planned for years. Each man understood what the others wanted, what they could offer, what they demanded in return. The alliance they forged that night was based not on friendship, though there was genuine respect between them, but on the cold calculation of mutual benefit. Crassus would provide the financial backing for Caesar's ambitious legislative program and Pompey's needs for his veterans. His vast network of business connections would ensure that the triumvirate's decisions were implemented efficiently throughout the provinces. Pompey would lend his military prestige to legitimize their actions, his influence with the legions, to guarantee that opposition would think twice before resorting to violence. His popularity with the common soldiers, earned through years of shared dangers and generous distributions of booty, made him invaluable as the alliance's public face. Caesar, as consul, would provide the legal framework within which their plans could be executed. His mastery of Roman law, combined with his growing skill as an orator, would allow him to navigate the complex procedural requirements that governed senatorial business. But perhaps most importantly, each man would serve as insurance for the others, a guarantee that no individual member of the alliance could be isolated and destroyed by their common enemies. "We must be careful," Caesar warned as they prepared to seal their agreement. "This alliance must remain secret until we are ready to reveal it. Rome is not yet prepared to accept what we propose to do, and our enemies will move against us if they understand our intentions too early." The pact they made that night was sworn in the ancient manner, with wine mixed with their blood and prayers offered to the gods who governed oaths and friendship. But the real bond between them was forged not by ritual, but by necessity, the recognition that their individual ambitions could only be achieved through collective action. In the months that followed, as Caesar assumed the consulship and began to implement their shared agenda, the alliance operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Legislation that should have required months of debate was passed in days. Opposition that should have been insurmountable melted away before the combined pressure of wealth, reputation, and legal authority. Caesar's consulship became a masterclass in political efficiency. His colleague in office, Marcus Bibulus, found himself so completely outmaneuvered that contemporary wags began referring to the year not as the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but as the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Opposition senators who had prepared elaborate speeches against triumviral measures discovered that their objections were irrelevant. The votes had been counted before the debates began. Picture the scene in the Forum Romanum during those transformative months. Caesar standing before the assembled citizens, his voice carrying clearly across the packed square as he announced new distributions of land for Pompey's veterans, new contracts for Crassus's business enterprises, new opportunities for ordinary Romans to share in the prosperity that conquest had brought to the empire. Citizens of Rome, his words echoed from the marble walls that had heard so many promises before, we stand at the threshold of a new age. The conquests of our armies have filled our treasury. The wisdom of our laws has brought order to the world. The strength of our people has made us masters of the earth. It is past time that these achievements benefit not just the wealthy few, but all who call themselves Roman. The crowd's response was thunderous, a roar of approval that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient city. Here was someone who spoke to their hopes rather than their fears, who offered expansion rather than restriction, who promised that Rome's greatest days lay ahead rather than behind. But not everyone was pleased by these developments. In the shadows of colonnades and the private chambers of great houses, Caesar's enemies began to gather like storm clouds on a summer horizon. Marcus Porcius Cato, the moral voice of the Senate's conservative faction, spoke with increasing urgency about the danger posed by men who put personal ambition before constitutional tradition. "This is not government," Cato would thunder in the Senate House, his austere figure rigid with indignation. "This is conspiracy. These men mock our ancestors, corrupt our institutions, and reduce the sacred offices of the Republic to instruments of private gain." Cicero, the greatest orator of his generation, added his voice to the chorus of opposition, though his criticisms were more nuanced, more concerned with constitutional precedent than moral outrage. When three men can determine the fate of Rome through private agreements made in wine shops and back rooms, he warned in a speech that would be remembered long after its immediate purpose was forgotten, we have ceased to be a republic and become something else entirely, something our founders would not recognize and our descendants will not forgive. But opposition, however eloquent, could not compete with success. The triumvirate's first year was marked by achievement after achievement. Pompey's eastern arrangements were ratified, his veterans received their promised lands, Crassus's business interests flourished under favorable legislation, and Caesar himself secured a command in Gaul that would give him the opportunity to win the military glory necessary for his own advancement. The secret alliance had proven its worth, demonstrating that coordinated action by determined men could accomplish more in months than traditional methods had achieved in years. But success brought its own dangers, and as the three partners prepared to implement the next phase of their plans, each began to wonder whether his allies might not also be his most dangerous rivals. It was Pompey who first voiced the thought that haunted all their private moments. "We have shown that Rome can be governed efficiently," he said during one of their clandestine meetings, "but efficiency is not the same as stability. What happens when our interests begin to diverge? What happens when two of us want the same thing, and there is only enough for one?" Caesar smiled, that same enigmatic expression that had charmed pirates and puzzled philosophers. "Then we will discover whether we are truly friends or merely allies of convenience." Crassus, ever practical, cut to the heart of the matter. Friendship is a luxury we may not be able to afford much longer, but partnership based on mutual benefit, that can last as long as we all remember that our strength comes from unity, not from individual brilliance. And so the first triumvirate entered its second phase, no longer a secret conspiracy, but an acknowledged reality that dominated Roman politics like a three-headed colossus. The marriage between Caesar and Calpurnia, daughter of one of Pompey's allies, formalized what had begun as mere political convenience. Pompey's own marriage to Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter, created bonds of blood that seemed to guarantee the alliance's permanence. But underneath the public displays of unity, tensions were already beginning to show. Crassus resented being seen as merely the financier of the partnership. Pompey chafed at sharing authority with men he considered his intellectual inferiors. And Caesar, preparing to depart for Gaul and the military campaign that would make his reputation, wondered whether he would return to find Rome ruled by his partners or his rivals. On his last night in the city before departing for his provincial command, Caesar stood once again in his garden, now expanded and beautified by the wealth his consulship had brought him. The modest house in the Subura had been replaced by a mansion on the Palatine Hill, with views across the Campus Martius to the hills beyond. It was a tangible symbol of how far he had risen, but also a reminder of how much further he intended to go. Julia came to bid him farewell, her young face bright with the kind of happiness that comes from a marriage based on genuine affection rather than political necessity. At 19, she possessed her father's intelligence and charm, but without the calculating edge that marked his every interaction with the world. "Take care of Pompey," Caesar told her, his voice gentle with paternal concern. "He is a good man, but he has been a soldier too long to understand the subtleties of civilian politics. Help him remember that strength without wisdom is merely force, and force without justice is tyranny." She nodded solemnly, understanding more than her years should have allowed about the delicate balance her father was trying to maintain. "And father," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears, "remember that conquest is easier than governance. The Gauls you are going to fight will resist you openly. Their opposition will be honest and direct. When you return to Rome, you may find that your greatest battles are with enemies who smile while they sharpen their knives." Caesar embraced his daughter, feeling in that moment the weight of all the choices that had brought him to this point. The boy who had once dreamed of glory in the narrow streets of the Subura was gone, replaced by a man who had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman politics with skill and determination. But Julia's words carried a prophetic quality that would haunt his thoughts in the years to come. The alliance he had forged with Pompey and Crassus had given him the platform he needed to pursue his ultimate ambitions, but it had also created obligations and enmities that would shape the rest of his life. As dawn broke over the 7 hills and Caesar prepared to set out for Gaul, he could not have known that he was leaving Rome for what would be the last time as a private citizen. When he returned, it would be as something the Republic had never seen before. A general whose conquests had made him richer than Crassus, more celebrated than Pompey, and more dangerous to the established order than either of his former partners had ever imagined possible. The first triumvirate had accomplished its purpose, proving that determined men could reshape the world through coordinated action. But it had also unleashed forces that would ultimately destroy not just the alliance itself, but the very system it had sought to control. In the end, the 3 men who had met in that wine shop to divide the world between them would discover that the world was not big enough for all their ambitions. And when the final accounting was made, only one of them would survive to see the empire their partnership had made possible, though by then, the cost of that survival would have transformed him into something their friendship had never been designed to contain. The morning mist clung to the banks of the Rhone like the breath of sleeping gods, and through it came the sound that would echo across 8 years of war, the measured tramp of Roman legions on the march. At their head rode Gaius Julius Caesar, no longer the smooth politician of Roman drawing rooms, but a general leading his men into a wilderness that stretched beyond the edge of the known world. Picture him in that moment, 42 years old and sitting easily in his saddle, despite having spent most of his life in the city's marble halls. The proconsul's cloak fell in purple folds across his shoulders, but beneath it he wore the practical leather and bronze of a working soldier. His thin face, already showing the first lines of middle age, was set in concentration as he studied the reports his scouts had brought from the country ahead. Gaul. The word itself seemed to whisper of mystery and danger, of forests so vast that a man could walk for months without seeing the sky, of tribes whose warriors painted themselves blue and took the heads of their enemies as trophies. To most Romans it was the edge of civilization, a place where men still lived like beasts, and the old gods demanded blood sacrifices under the light of the moon. But Caesar saw something different in those misty hills and dark forests. He saw opportunity, he saw glory, he saw the chance to write his name in letters large enough that all the world would read them and remember. The immediate crisis that had brought him north was simple enough to understand. The Helvetii, a tribe of Gallic Celts, had decided to abandon their mountain homes in what would one day be called Switzerland and migrate en masse to new lands in the west. It was a movement of an entire people, men, women, children, cattle, and all their worldly possessions, traveling in a vast column that stretched for miles across the landscape. Under ordinary circumstances, such a migration might have been none of Rome's concern. But the route the Helvetii proposed to take would carry them through the province, that strip of Roman territory in southern Gaul that protected the vital land bridge between Italy and Spain. And their passage would inevitably disrupt the delicate balance of power among the Gallic tribes, potentially threatening Rome's allies and trade routes. At least, that was the official justification Caesar offered to the Senate for his decision to intervene. The reality, as his closest associates understood, was far more complex and far more ambitious. "The Helvetii are not our real enemy," Caesar confided to Titus Labienus, his most trusted lieutenant, as they made camp on the first night of the campaign. "They are merely our excuse. Our real purpose here is to bring the light of Roman civilization to peoples who have lived in darkness since the world began." Labienus, a grizzled veteran who had served with distinction in earlier campaigns, studied his commander with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read the moods and intentions of generals. There was something in Caesar's voice, a quality of absolute certainty, that suggested this would be no ordinary provincial command. "And if the Gauls prefer their darkness?" he asked. Caesar's smile was visible even in the flickering light of the campfire. "Then we will teach them to love the light." The first major engagement came at Bibracte, a fortified settlement of the Aedui tribe, where Caesar's 4 legions, roughly 25,000 men, faced a Helvetii army nearly twice their size. It was the kind of odds that would have given pause to more cautious commanders, but Caesar had studied every account of Gallic warfare he could find, and he believed he understood his enemy's strengths and weaknesses. The Gauls were magnificent individual warriors, brave to the point of recklessness and skilled with sword and spear. But they lacked the discipline and tactical flexibility that generations of professional training had given Roman soldiers. Where the Gauls fought as heroes seeking personal glory, the Romans fought as a machine designed for collective victory. Picture the battlefield in the moments before the armies clashed, the Helvetii spread across the hillside like a tide of bronze and iron, their war cries echoing from the mountains, as they struck their shields with their weapons in the rhythm that had terrified enemies for centuries. Their chiefs rode before the ranks on prancing horses, magnificent in their torques of twisted gold and their cloaks of wolf fur, calling upon their gods and ancestors to witness their courage. Facing them, the Roman legions stood in perfect silence, their shields locked together in walls of painted wood and bronze, their spears angled forward like the quills of some massive porcupine. No war cries, no individual displays of bravery, just the deadly patience of professional soldiers, waiting for the moment when training and discipline would prove themselves superior to valor and tradition. Caesar himself rode along the Roman line, his voice carrying clearly to every man in his army. This was the moment when all his years of studying rhetoric would pay their dividends, when the skills he had learned in the forum would serve him on the battlefield. "Soldiers of Rome," he called, his words carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Today you fight not just for victory, but for civilization itself. Behind us lies the world our ancestors built, a world of law and order, of justice and prosperity, of peace won through strength. Before us lies darkness and barbarism, the chaos that swallows nations and turns men into beasts." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the ranks of upturned faces, each man straining to hear every word. "Today we teach the world that Rome's eagles cast shadows that stretch across all the earth. Today we show these barbarians what it means to stand against the will of the eternal city. Today we fight, not for gold or glory, but for the right of civilized men to live in a civilized world." The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical execution. The Helvetii charged with all the fury of their ancestors, their long swords glittering in the afternoon sun, their war cries shaking the earth beneath Caesar's feet. For a moment, a terrifying, heart-stopping moment. It seemed as though sheer ferocity might triumph over discipline. But the Roman line held, shields locked together, spears thrust forward. The legions absorbed the Gallic charge like a cliff absorbing the fury of storm waves. And then, as the barbarian attack began to slow, as individual courage started to falter against organized resistance, Caesar unleashed his reserve cohorts in a flanking movement that turned the tide of battle in minutes. The slaughter that followed was terrible and decisive. The Helvetii, caught between the hammer of the reserve cohorts and the anvil of the main line, broke and fled in all directions. Those who could not escape threw down their weapons and begged for mercy, their proud war cries replaced by the whimpering of beaten men. But it was in the aftermath of victory that Caesar revealed the true genius of his approach to conquest. Where other Roman generals might have enslaved the defeated tribes or exacted crushing tribute, Caesar chose a different path entirely. Standing among the captured chiefs of the Helvetii, still magnificent in their defeat, Caesar spoke not as a conqueror, but as a teacher, addressing students who had finally grasped a difficult lesson. "You fought bravely," he told them, his Latin translated by interpreters into the musical syllables of their own tongue. "Your courage honors your ancestors and your gods, but courage without wisdom is merely waste, and wisdom teaches us that some forces are too great to resist. Rome does not seek to destroy you. We seek to elevate you. Join us willingly and you will share in the benefits of Roman peace. Continue to oppose us and you will share only in the fate of those who mistake stubbornness for strength." It was an offer unprecedented in its generosity and revolutionary in its implications. Traditional Roman policy toward conquered barbarians was simple: enslave them, tax them, use them as raw material for the empire's expansion. But Caesar understood something his predecessors had missed, that willing allies were infinitely more valuable than sullen subjects. Many of the Helvetii accepted his terms, agreeing to return to their mountain homes under Roman protection rather than continue their migration westward. Their young men were invited to serve in auxiliary units attached to Caesar's legions. Their chiefs were treated with the respect due to allied rulers rather than defeated enemies. Their culture and customs were preserved rather than suppressed. Word of Caesar's clemency spread through Gaul like wildfire, carried by merchants and wanderers who had witnessed the unprecedented spectacle of Roman mercy. Tribes that had been preparing to resist the invaders began to reconsider their options. Chiefs who had been sharpening their swords started composing messages of friendship and alliance, but not everyone was impressed by Caesar's magnanimity. Ariovistus, king of the Germanic Suebi and the most powerful ruler in eastern Gaul, saw the Roman victory not as a demonstration of superior civilization, but as a threat to his own ambitions. If Caesar was allowed to continue unopposed, if his policy of clemency succeeded in winning over the Gallic tribes, then the balance of power that had allowed Germanic expansion into Gaul would be permanently altered. The challenge came in the form of an embassy that reached Caesar's winter quarters, as snow began to fall across the darkening landscape. The German envoys were impressive men, tall and fair-haired, dressed in furs and bronze ornaments that spoke of wealth won through conquest. Their leader, a chief named Vercassivelaunus, carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to having his words treated as commands. Ariovistus, king of the Suebi, friend of the Roman people, sends greetings to the proconsul, the Germanic chief announced, his Latin heavily accented but perfectly comprehensible. My lord wonders why Roman eagles have flown so far from their nests. Surely the great Caesar has business enough in his own lands without troubling himself with barbarian squabbles in the forests of Gaul. Caesar received the embassy in his praetorium, surrounded by the symbols of Roman authority, the fasces of his office, the standards of his legions, the maps that showed the growing extent of Roman influence. He had dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing the purple-striped toga that marked his proconsular rank, his appearance calculated to project both dignity and power. "Tell your king," Caesar replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him so well in Roman politics, that Rome goes where Roman interests lead. The Helvetii threatened our allies and our trade routes. We responded as any civilized power must when faced with such provocations. If King Ariovistus wishes to discuss the matter further, he is welcome to meet with me at a place and time of mutual convenience. But the German chief's next words carried a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the tent walls. My lord also wishes the proconsul to know that the lands east of the Vosges Mountains belong to the Suebi by right of conquest. Any Roman forces found in those territories will be considered invaders and dealt with accordingly. This is not a threat. It is a statement of fact, delivered in friendship to avoid misunderstandings. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the whisper of wind through the camp's palisade. Caesar's officers, men who had seen him face down angry mobs in the Forum and hostile senators in the Curia, watched their commander's face for any sign of how he would respond to such an unprecedented challenge. When Caesar finally spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was something in his tone that made hardened centurions unconsciously straighten their shoulders. Convey my gratitude to King Ariovistus for his clarification of his position. Tell him that I look forward to our meeting, where we can discuss the boundaries of our respective spheres of influence. Tell him also that I have found the mountains and forests of Gaul quite beautiful in winter, so beautiful, in fact, that I may decide to extend my stay indefinitely. The German embassy departed the next morning, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground as they rode eastward toward the Rhine. Behind them, they left a Roman camp that hummed with the quiet activity of men preparing for war. That night, as snow fell steadily outside his quarters, Caesar sat with his senior officers around a brazier that cast dancing shadows on the tent walls. The maps spread before them showed a land of forests and rivers, mountains and valleys, marked with the symbols that indicated tribal territories and Roman positions. "He's testing us," Labienus observed, his weathered finger tracing the line of the Rhine on the largest map. "Ariovistus wants to know if we're here to stay or just passing through. Our answer will determine whether he treats us as a temporary inconvenience or a permanent threat." Marcus Crassus the Younger, son of Caesar's ally in the triumvirate and one of the rising stars among the army's junior officers, leaned forward eagerly. "Then we show him, don't we? March into his territory, defeat his army, teach him the same lesson we taught the Helvetii." But Caesar was studying the maps with the patience of a chess master, contemplating his next several moves simultaneously. "War with Ariovistus is inevitable," he said finally, "but the timing must be right. Winter campaigns in these mountains would cost us more men than any victory could justify. We wait for spring, use the time to strengthen our alliances with the Gallic tribes, gather intelligence about German tactics and dispositions." He paused, his finger tracing the winding course of the Rhine River. "And we make sure that when we do fight, it's not just Caesar's legions against Ariovistus's warriors, but civilization against barbarism. The Gauls must see this conflict as their war too, their chance to choose between the future Rome offers and the past that Germany represents." The winter passed in careful preparation. Caesar sent envoys to tribal chiefs throughout Gaul, not demanding immediate allegiance, but offering friendship, trade agreements, and protection against Germanic raids. His engineers surveyed roads and river crossings, his quartermasters negotiated contracts for supplies and equipment, his intelligence officers cultivated networks of informants among merchants and slaves who moved freely between Roman and barbarian territories. Most importantly, Caesar used the long winter evenings to write, not military dispatches or administrative reports, but detailed accounts of his campaigns designed for consumption by the Roman public. These commentaries, written in the third person with an objectivity that masked their propaganda value, would be copied and distributed throughout the empire, creating an image of Caesar as not just a successful general, but a literary artist capable of transforming the raw material of war into something approaching epic poetry. "Listen to this," he said one evening, reading aloud to his staff from his latest composition. All Gaul is divided into three parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani another, and the third a people who in their own language are called Celts, in ours Gauls. All these differ from each other in language, customs, and laws. The simple elegance of the prose, the way it transformed a complex political and cultural landscape into comprehensible categories, demonstrated once again Caesar's genius for making the alien familiar, the chaotic orderly. When spring finally came to Gaul, it arrived with the kind of dramatic suddenness that seemed to promise great events. Snow melted from the mountainsides in rushing torrents, flowers bloomed in meadows that had been white with frost for months, and across the camps of both armies, men began to sharpen their weapons and dream of glory. The meeting between Caesar and Ariovistus finally took place on a plain near modern-day Besançon, with both armies drawn up in battle formation on opposite sides of the field. The two commanders met in the space between their forces, each accompanied by a small escort of officers and interpreters. Ariovistus was everything Caesar had expected, tall and powerfully built, with the kind of massive presence that dominated any space he occupied. His hair and beard were the color of burnished copper, braided with gold ornaments that caught the morning light. He wore a mail shirt that had probably been taken from some defeated Roman officer, and at his side hung a sword that looked capable of splitting a man from skull to pelvis with a single blow. But it was the German king's eyes that held Caesar's attention, pale blue and utterly without warmth, like winter sky reflected in ice. This was a man who had spent his life taking what he wanted through force, who understood no law but strength, and no negotiation but the kind that took place between sword blades. "So," Ariovistus said in heavily accented Latin, his voice carrying easily across the field to where both armies strained to hear, "you are the famous Caesar. You are smaller than I expected." Caesar smiled, the same enigmatic expression that had charmed pirates and confounded senators. "And you are exactly as large as your reputation suggested. I trust we can resolve our differences without testing whether size matters more than skill." What followed was less a negotiation than a ritual exchange of positions, each man stating his claims and demands with the formality of priests reciting ancient prayers. Ariovistus insisted on his right to rule all lands east of the Rhine, demanded tribute from the Gallic tribes under his protection, and warned that continued Roman interference would force him to take measures he preferred to avoid. Caesar replied with equal formality, acknowledging Ariovistus's friendship with Rome, while making clear that Roman interests extended wherever Roman allies required protection. He spoke of civilization and barbarism, of law and chaos, of the benefits that would flow to all peoples who accepted Roman guidance, but beneath the diplomatic language, both men understood that they were really negotiating the terms of the war that would inevitably follow. The only question was whether it would begin immediately or after further maneuvering for advantage. The answer came when Ariovistus made a demand that revealed the true scope of his ambitions. Caesar must withdraw all Roman forces from Gaul within 30 days or face the consequences of Germanic wrath. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind across the plain and the nervous shifting of horses. Then Caesar spoke, his voice carrying clearly to every man on both sides of the field. "King Ariovistus," he said, his tone as formal as a judge pronouncing sentence, "I thank you for clarifying your position. It will make what follows much simpler for everyone involved." The battle that decided the fate of Gaul took place 3 days later on a field that would be watered with the blood of two peoples and remembered long after the names of the individual warriors had been forgotten. Caesar's tactical genius was on full display as he used his legion's superior discipline and training to neutralize the Germans' advantages in size and individual prowess. But perhaps more important than the military victory was the symbolic triumph it represented. Ariovistus, the great Germanic king who had dominated eastern Gaul through fear and force, fled the field in disgrace, his army scattered to the winds, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Word of the victory spread through Gaul with the speed of wildfire, carrying with it a message that would reshape the political landscape of the entire region. Rome was not just another player in the complex game of tribal politics, but a power capable of defeating any enemy. protecting any ally, imposing its will on any people. Tribal chiefs who had been hedging their bets, playing Romans against Germans in hopes of maintaining their independence, suddenly found themselves faced with a much simpler choice: accept Roman friendship willingly, or have Roman rule imposed upon them by force. Most chose friendship, at least initially. Caesar's policy of clemency toward defeated enemies and generosity toward willing allies created a momentum of cooperation that swept through Gaul like a gentle avalanche. Tribes that had been blood enemies for generations found themselves united under Roman protection. Trade routes that had been interrupted by constant warfare reopened under Roman guarantees of safe passage. But in the northern reaches of Gaul, among the Belgae, those fierce tribes that Caesar himself would later describe as the bravest of all the Gallic peoples, a different reaction was taking shape. If one German king could be defeated, the Belgic chiefs reasoned, then perhaps the Romans were not as invincible as they appeared. If Ariovistus had fallen because he faced Caesar alone, then perhaps the solution was for all the enemies of Rome to unite in a single overwhelming assault. As summer faded into autumn and Caesar prepared his legions for their second winter in Gaul, reports began to reach him of strange movements in the north. Belgic warriors were gathering in unprecedented numbers, their chiefs meeting in secret councils, their druids performing sacrifices to gods of war whose names had not been spoken in generations. "They're planning something," Labienus reported after returning from a reconnaissance mission that had taken him deep into Belgic territory. "The whole north is stirring like a nest of angry wasps. Every tribe from the Rhine to the Atlantic is sending warriors to the great gathering." Caesar received this news with the calm satisfaction of a general whose plans were unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. The defeat of Ariovistus had been only the first movement in a much larger composition, and the Belgic response was precisely what he had hoped to provoke. "Good," he said simply, his finger tracing new lines on the maps that covered his table. "Let them gather. Let them unite. Let them convince themselves that numbers alone can overcome discipline and training. When spring comes, we'll give them the chance to test their theory." But even as he spoke with confidence about the coming campaign, Caesar understood that the stakes were higher now than they had been against either the Helvetii or the Germans. The Belgae were not migrating tribes or foreign invaders, but the original inhabitants of northern Gaul, fighting for their homeland and their way of life. Their resistance would be fiercer, their knowledge of the terrain more complete, their motivation more desperate. Moreover, defeat against such an alliance would not just end Caesar's Gallic campaign, but probably his political career as well. The enemies he had left behind in Rome, Cato, Cicero, and all the others who had opposed the triumvirate, would seize upon any failure as proof that the new men were unfit to govern the empire. As winter closed over Gaul once again, Caesar found himself facing the greatest test of his career thus far. Behind him lay 2 years of stunning success that had made his name famous throughout the Roman world. Ahead lay challenges that would either elevate him to the level of history's greatest conquerors, or see him remembered as just another ambitious politician who had reached too high and fallen too far. In his private moments, as snow fell silently outside his quarters and the camp settled into the quiet rhythm of men preparing for sleep, Caesar sometimes allowed himself to wonder what his life might have been like if he had chosen a different path. He could have been content with the pontificate, with a comfortable career in the Senate, with the modest honors that came to men who knew their place and stayed within its boundaries. But such thoughts never lasted long. He had been born for this, for the clash of armies and the fate of nations, for the moment when a single decision could reshape the world. The boy who had pressed his ear to the bronze doors of the Senate House had always known that ordinary life would never be enough for him. Now, as he prepared for the campaign that would either make or break his reputation, Caesar felt the familiar stirring of anticipation that had marked every great moment of his life. Somewhere in the northern forests, an alliance of barbarian warriors was preparing to test themselves against Roman discipline. They would discover, as so many others had learned before them, that there was a difference between courage and wisdom, between fighting and conquering, between dying gloriously and living to shape the future. The boy from the Subura had become the master of Gaul. But his greatest battles still lay ahead, waiting in the mists of a tomorrow that would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of the world itself. Spring came to Gaul like a whispered promise of violence, carried on winds that smelled of melting snow and sharpened steel. In the forests of the north, where ancient oaks had stood since before Rome was even a dream in the minds of shepherds on 7 small hills, the greatest alliance in Celtic history was taking shape. A confederation of tribes united by a single, burning purpose: to drive the Roman eagles back across the Alps and reclaim the freedom their ancestors had known. Caesar received the first reports of the Belgic Confederation, while the last snows still clung to the mountains around his winter quarters. Picture him in those quiet moments before dawn, standing at the entrance to his praetorium, with a dispatch scroll in his hands, reading by the flickering light of oil lamps, while his camp slowly stirred to life around him. The intelligence was sobering in its scope. The Belgae, those fierce tribes of northern Gaul who had remained largely untouched by Roman influence, had overcome generations of mutual hostility to form an alliance that included virtually every warrior between the Rhine and the Atlantic. Ambiorix of the Eburones, Commius of the Atrebates, Vercingetorix's young cousin Vercassivelaunus, names that would soon echo through history like thunder across a battlefield, all had pledged their swords to a cause that seemed to offer only death or glory. 300,000 warriors, Labienus said quietly, reading over his commander's shoulder. Maybe more. Every man capable of bearing arms from the Rhine to the sea. Caesar folded the dispatch carefully, his face revealing nothing of whatever calculations were taking place behind those dark, intelligent eyes. At 44, he had learned to mask his thoughts as completely as any actor on a stage, but those who knew him best could sense the quickening of his pulse, the subtle tension that marked moments when destiny hung in the balance. 300,000, he repeated thoughtfully, against our 8 legions, roughly 40,000 men, if we count auxiliaries and support troops. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. Even allowing for the superior training and equipment of Roman soldiers, even accounting for the tactical advantages of disciplined formations over barbarian mobs, the odds were daunting enough to give pause to the most confident commander. But Caesar had spent his life turning impossible odds into inevitable victories, and what others saw as a crisis, he recognized as an opportunity. A victory against such overwhelming numbers would not just secure his position in Gaul, it would establish his reputation as one of history's greatest military geniuses, a general whose name would be spoken in the same breath as Alexander and Scipio. "Send word to Marcus Crassus in Aquitania," he commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "Tell him to secure his front and prepare to send reinforcements if called upon. Dispatch messengers to our allies among the Aedui and Remi. Remind them that their friendship with Rome has never been more important, and that their loyalty will be remembered when the final accounting is made." As spring advanced and the roads became passable again, Caesar began the delicate process of maneuvering his forces northward while simultaneously trying to split the Belgic Confederation before it could achieve its full strength. It was a campaign that would test every lesson he had learned about warfare, diplomacy, and the complex psychology of leadership under pressure. The first engagement came at the river Sabes, where Caesar's advance guard encountered a Belgic scouting force that fought with the kind of desperate fury that suggested this would be unlike any war the Romans had previously experienced in Gaul. These were not warriors seeking individual glory or fighting for abstract concepts of honor. These were men defending their homes, their families, their entire way of life against an invader whose victory would mean the end of everything they held sacred. Picture the scene as Caesar himself described it in his dispatches to Rome. Roman soldiers struggling through thick forest, where their formations could not deploy properly, where every tree might hide an enemy archer, where the very ground seemed to conspire against them. The Belgae had chosen their battleground carefully, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to negate many of the advantages that had served the legions so well in previous campaigns. For a terrifying moment, As ambush followed ambush and Caesar's carefully planned advance began to dissolve into chaos, it seemed possible that the great general might finally have met his match. Centurions who had followed him through every campaign since he first came to Gaul found themselves fighting for their lives in unnamed clearings, where the sun barely penetrated the canopy overhead. But it was in this moment of crisis that Caesar demonstrated the quality that separated him from other commanders of his generation. While his subordinates struggled to maintain order in their individual commands, while panic began to spread through the ranks like a contagion, Caesar himself seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying broken units, organizing counterattacks, transforming defensive disaster into offensive opportunity. Romans, his voice rang through the forest, somehow audible above the clash of weapons and the screams of wounded men. Look around you. These trees have stood for 1,000 years, and today they will witness something new, the day when the sons of Mars proved that no force on earth can stand against them when they fight as one. He had seized a shield from a fallen legionnaire and stationed himself in the front rank of the 10th Legion, his beloved 10th, the unit that had followed him since his first day in Gaul. The sight of their general fighting beside them, sharing their dangers and their glory, transformed the morale of the entire army in minutes. The Belgic attack, which had seemed irresistible in its initial fury, gradually began to lose momentum as it encountered the kind of disciplined resistance that Roman training had been designed to provide. Individual acts of heroism, no matter how magnificent, could not overcome the systematic application of tactical doctrine that had been refined through centuries of warfare. But perhaps the most crucial moment of the entire campaign came not during the heat of battle but in its aftermath, when Caesar made a decision that revealed his growing understanding of the psychological dimensions of conquest. Standing among the Belgic dead, young men who had died far from home in service to a cause they believed was just, Caesar felt something he had not expected: genuine respect for enemies who had fought with such courage despite facing hopeless odds. These were not the calculating Germans who fought for profit, or the migrating Helvetii who fought for necessity. These were patriots defending their homeland with the same kind of devotion that had once inspired Romans at Cannae and Elaea. "Bury them with honor," he commanded his soldiers, many of whom looked surprised by such an order. These men died as soldiers should, with weapons in their hands and their faces to the enemy. They deserve the respect that brave men owe to other brave men, regardless of which gods they served or which eagles they followed. It was a gesture unprecedented in its magnanimity, and word of Caesar's treatment of the enemy dead spread through Belgic territory faster than mounted messengers could carry official dispatches. Tribes that had been preparing to fight to the last man began to reconsider their options. If the Roman general honored the courage of his enemies, if he showed mercy to the defeated and respect to the fallen, then perhaps there was room for negotiation that did not require the complete destruction of one side or the other. The psychological effect was exactly what Caesar had calculated. One by one, Belgic tribes began to send ambassadors to his camp, not to surrender unconditionally, but to explore the possibility of the kind of honorable accommodation that might preserve their dignity while acknowledging Roman supremacy. The negotiations that followed were among the most complex of Caesar's career, requiring him to balance the legitimate demands of Roman security with the equally legitimate desires of proud peoples to maintain some measure of autonomy. Each tribe presented unique circumstances. Each chief had specific concerns that needed to be addressed. Each agreement had to be crafted carefully to avoid creating precedents that might complicate future settlements. Picture Caesar in his command tent during those long summer evenings, surrounded by maps and documents, receiving one delegation after another as the sun set behind the hills of northern Gaul. His interpreters worked constantly, translating not just words, but cultural concepts that had no direct equivalence between Latin and the various Celtic dialects. His scribes recorded every detail of every agreement, creating the legal framework that would govern Roman-Belgic relations for generations to come. But not all the Belgic tribes were ready to accept accommodation, no matter how generous its terms. In the far north, along the shores of what later generations would call the English Channel. The Nervi, perhaps the fiercest warriors in all of Gaul, were preparing for a final, desperate gambit that would either drive the Romans from Belgic territory forever or die in the attempt. The Nervi had learned from the defeats of their allies, had studied Roman tactics with the careful attention of professionals trying to understand a superior enemy. They knew they could not meet the legions in open battle, could not hope to overcome Roman discipline through frontal assault. Instead, they planned something far more dangerous, a surprise attack on Caesar's camp while his forces were divided and vulnerable. The assault came at dawn on a day when mist lay thick over the Sabes River, providing perfect cover for warriors who had painted themselves with woad and ash until they seemed like spirits emerging from the other world. The Nervi had waited until Caesar's army was in the process of making camp, when the soldiers' attention was focused on routine tasks rather than immediate dangers. For a moment, a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, it seemed as though the impossible might happen. Roman sentries fell with Nervi arrows in their throats before they could sound the alarm. Auxiliary units, caught by surprise while watering their horses, were overrun before they could form defensive lines. Even some of the legions found themselves fighting desperately just to avoid being scattered like leaves before a hurricane. Caesar himself was nearly killed in the first minutes of the attack, saved only by the quick reflexes of his bodyguard and the loyalty of soldiers who threw themselves between their general and the Nervi spears. His scarlet cloak, the symbol of his authority, was torn by a blade that missed his neck by inches. His horse was killed beneath him, forcing him to continue the battle on foot like any common legionnaire. But once again, it was Caesar's personal intervention that turned the tide of battle. Seizing a standard from a fallen signifer, he rallied the scattered remnants of 2 legions and led them in a countercharge that split the Nervi attack at its crucial moment. "With me!" he shouted, his voice somehow carrying above the din of battle. "For Rome, for honor, for the right of civilized men to live in a civilized world." The fighting that followed was brutal and decisive. The Nervi, committed to victory or death, fought with the kind of desperate courage that poets would sing about for centuries. They took no prisoners and asked for no quarter, standing over their fallen chiefs until the last warrior died with his sword in his hand and his face toward the enemy. When the battle finally ended, when the last of the Nervi lay still on ground soaked with blood, Caesar stood among the dead with something approaching sorrow in his eyes. These had been magnificent enemies, brave, skilled, utterly committed to their cause. Their defeat was necessary for Roman security, but it was also the end of something irreplaceable, a way of life that had existed since before recorded history began. "Remember this day," he told his assembled officers as burial details began their grim work. "We have witnessed the death of heroes. The Nervi are no more, not because they lacked courage, but because courage alone is not enough when it stands against the ordered will of civilized men. Let their example teach us humility in victory and respect for those who choose death before dishonor." The destruction of the Nervii marked the effective end of Belgic resistance to Roman rule. The surviving tribes, awed by the fate of their most powerful allies, and impressed by Caesar's combination of military skill and political wisdom, accepted terms that granted them considerable autonomy in exchange for acknowledgement of Roman supremacy. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Belgic campaign was not the expansion of Roman territory or the addition of new tribes to the growing list of Caesar's allies. It was the transformation of Caesar himself from a talented general into something approaching a military legend. The dispatches he sent to Rome describing his victories were copied and distributed throughout the empire, creating an image of Caesar as not just a successful commander, but a figure of almost mythic proportions. Here was a general who could defeat armies 3 times the size of his own, who could turn disaster into triumph through sheer force of will, who could inspire ordinary soldiers to perform extraordinary deeds. In the Forum Romanum, crowds gathered to hear public readings of Caesar's commentaries, hanging on every word as scribes recounted the latest exploits of the proconsul, who was extending Roman power into lands that had existed only in legend. Senators who had dismissed him as merely a clever politician began to speak of him with something approaching awe. Even his enemies were forced to acknowledge that Caesar had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of Roman warfare. But success brought its own dangers, and as Caesar prepared for his 4th year in Gaul, he was beginning to understand that his greatest enemies might not be barbarian warriors with painted faces and iron swords, but Roman politicians with silk togas and silver tongues. Reports from Rome spoke of growing opposition to his command, of senators who argued that Caesar had exceeded his authority, of proposals to recall him before he became too powerful to control. Cato, that incorruptible voice of Republican tradition, was already demanding investigations into Caesar's conduct. Cicero, ever the political weather vane, was beginning to distance himself from the triumvirate as its popular support showed signs of weakness. Most troubling of all were the reports about his partners in the alliance that had made his Gallic command possible. Pompey and Crassus, who had once worked together so effectively to advance their mutual interests, were beginning to view each other as rivals rather than allies. The bonds that had held the triumvirate together were showing signs of strain that could lead to civil war if not carefully managed. As autumn settled over Gaul and Caesar's legions prepared for another winter of planning and preparation, the general found himself facing challenges that could not be resolved through tactical brilliance or personal courage. The enemies gathering against him in Rome were not barbarians who could be defeated in open battle, but sophisticated politicians who understood how to use law and tradition as weapons more deadly than any sword. Standing in his command tent as the first snows began to fall, studying maps that showed the extent of his conquests, while reading dispatches that spoke of plots and counterplots in the distant capital, Caesar felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. He had come to Gaul seeking military glory and political advancement. He had found both in measures beyond his most optimistic dreams. But he had also discovered something else, something that would change not just his own life, but the course of human history, the intoxicating knowledge that a single man, if he possessed sufficient will and wisdom, could reshape the world according to his vision. The boy from the Subura had become the conqueror of Gaul. But his greatest test still lay ahead, waiting in the marble halls of Rome where his enemies were sharpening their knives and preparing to teach him that some victories come at a price that no man should be willing to pay. The Druids came in the deep of winter, when the world lay wrapped in silence, and the ancient gods seemed closest to the realm of mortal men. They moved through the snow-covered forests of Gaul like shadows given substance, their white robes blending with the winter landscape, until they seemed more spirit than flesh. In sacred groves where mistletoe grew on oak trees older than memory, they gathered to discuss something that had never before been spoken aloud in all their centuries of wisdom: the possibility that the Romans, for all their power and sophistication, might actually be defeated. It was the 5th year of Caesar's Gallic command, and the comfortable assumptions that had governed the early campaigns were beginning to crumble like leaves before an autumn wind. What had started as a series of discrete tribal conflicts was slowly revealing itself as something far more complex and dangerous, a fundamental collision between two completely different ways of organizing human civilization. Picture the scene in one of those hidden groves where ancient trees formed a natural cathedral beneath stars that had witnessed the birth and death of nations. The chief druid, his beard white as the snow around his feet, spoke in the musical cadences of old Celtic, his words carrying prophecies that had been dreamed in sacred darkness and refined in decades of scholarly debate. "The Romans bring roads," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible to every man in the circle. "But their roads lead only to Rome. They bring law, but their law serves only Roman interests. They bring peace, but it is the peace of the grave. Silence where once there was song, order where once there was freedom." Around him, the assembled druids nodded slowly, their faces grave with the weight of decisions that would affect not just their own generation, but all those yet to be born. These were men who thought in centuries rather than years, who understood that some choices once made could never be unmade. The question before us, the chief druid continued, is whether we will preserve our way of life by accommodating the Romans, or whether we will preserve it by destroying them utterly. There is no middle path. The eagles of Rome do not share the sky with any other bird of prey. The debate that followed lasted through the longest night of the year, with voices rising and falling like the wind through the trees overhead. Some argued for accommodation, pointing to Caesar's relative moderation in his treatment of defeated tribes. Others called for resistance, warning that Roman mercy was merely a tool designed to make conquest more palatable to the conquered. But gradually, as dawn approached and the Druids prepared to return to their scattered communities, a consensus began to emerge. The Romans had proven that they could not be defeated piecemeal, tribe by tribe, through the kind of individual courage that had served their ancestors for generations. If they were to be stopped at all, it would require something unprecedented in Gallic history: total unity, absolute coordination, the sacrifice of ancient grievances in service to a shared vision of freedom. The man they chose to lead this desperate gambit was young for such responsibility, barely 30 years old, with the kind of lean, intense features that suggested intelligence married to uncompromising will. His name was Vercingetorix, and he came from the Arverni, one of the most powerful tribes in central Gaul. More importantly, he had spent time in Roman service, had studied their tactics and psychology with the careful attention of a man who understood that knowledge of your enemy was the first requirement for victory. When word of the Great Rebellion reached Caesar's winter quarters, it came not as a single dramatic announcement, but as a series of increasingly troubling reports that painted a picture of coordinated resistance, unlike anything he had previously encountered in Gaul. Tribes that had accepted Roman rule for years were suddenly declaring their independence. Supply convoys were being ambushed by warriors who seemed to vanish into the landscape like smoke. Most ominously, Roman merchants and administrators throughout Gaul were simply disappearing, their fate unknown, but their absence ominous. "It's different this time," Labienus reported, after returning from a reconnaissance mission that had taken him deep into Arverni territory. "This isn't tribal warfare or opportunistic raiding. Someone is coordinating the resistance, teaching them Roman tactics, showing them how to think strategically rather than just react emotionally." Caesar received this intelligence while standing in his praetorium, studying the great map that showed the extent of Roman influence in Gaul. Red markers indicated loyal tribes, black ones showed areas of active resistance, and an alarming number of previously red markers had been moved to the growing black cluster in the center of the province. At 46, Caesar had learned to read the subtle indicators that separated temporary setbacks from existential threats. The pattern emerging across Gaul suggested something far more dangerous than barbarian uprising. It looked like revolution, carefully planned and professionally executed by people who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of Roman power. "Summon the council," he commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark in moments of crisis. "Send word to all our allied tribes, those who remain allied. Tell them that Rome remembers its friends in dark times, as well as bright ones, and that loyalty will be rewarded when this storm passes." But even as he spoke with confidence about the eventual resolution of the crisis, Caesar understood that this campaign would test him in ways that none of his previous victories had prepared him for. Fighting individual tribes was one thing. They could be isolated, defeated in detail, their resistance broken through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic inducement. Fighting a coordinated alliance led by someone who understood Roman methods was something else entirely. The first major engagement of what would become known as the Great Gallic Revolt took place at Gergovia, the stronghold of the Arverni that perched on a hill like an eagle's nest, its walls following the natural contours of the rock until it seemed less like a human construction than a natural feature of the landscape. Caesar's approach to the siege demonstrated his growing understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. Rather than attempting a direct assault that would cost thousands of Roman lives and might fail anyway, he chose to surround the settlement, and wait for hunger and despair to accomplish what force could not. "Time is our ally," he explained to his assembled officers as they studied the fortress from their camp in the valley below. Vercingetorix has united the tribes through appeals to their pride and their fear, but pride doesn't fill empty bellies, and fear becomes harder to sustain when nothing terrible actually happens day after day. But Caesar had underestimated both the determination of his enemies and the tactical genius of their leader. Vercingetorix had learned Roman methods too well to make the mistake of allowing himself to be trapped in a static defense. Instead, he used Gergovia as bait, drawing Caesar's forces into a position where they could be attacked from multiple directions by relief armies that appeared as if conjured from the very earth itself. The battle that followed was among the most desperate of Caesar's career. Roman formations that had dominated every previous battlefield found themselves surrounded by enemies who fought with Roman discipline but retained the Celtic warrior's willingness to die for his cause. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance as Caesar struggled to maintain control of a situation that seemed to be spiraling toward disaster. Picture Caesar himself in those crucial moments, his scarlet cloak making him a target for every Gallic archer within range, his voice hoarse from shouting orders above the din of battle. At 46, he was no longer young enough to fight in the front ranks without risking everything on his personal survival, but he was too experienced a commander not to understand when his physical presence was the difference between victory and defeat. "Romans!" he shouted, standing on a small rise where his words could reach the greatest number of his soldiers. "Look around you. These are the same enemies we defeated at Bibracte, the same barbarians who fled from us at the Sabis. They paint themselves blue and howl like wolves, but underneath the paint, they are still men, and men can be defeated by other men who refuse to yield." The Roman line held but barely. When darkness finally ended the fighting, both armies withdrew to lick their wounds and count their losses. Caesar had avoided defeat, but he had not achieved victory. And in the brutal mathematics of military campaigning, that was almost the same thing as losing. For the first time since coming to Gaul, Caesar found himself facing the possibility of genuine failure. His enemies were learning from their mistakes, adapting their tactics, proving that they could match Roman innovation with Celtic determination. Worse, reports from Rome spoke of growing political opposition to his command, of senators who argued that his failures in Gaul proved he was unfit for higher office. But it was in this moment of maximum danger that Caesar demonstrated the quality that separated him from other commanders of his generation, the ability to transform setbacks into opportunities, to find in apparent defeat the seeds of ultimate victory. "We have learned something valuable," he told his council of war, as they planned their response to the Gallic rebellion. "Vercingetorix is indeed a formidable enemy, perhaps the most dangerous we have faced since coming to Gaul. But his very success contains the elements of his eventual downfall. He has united the tribes through fear of Roman domination, but unity based on fear is always fragile. Give his followers a reason to doubt his invincibility, and the alliance will shatter like glass struck by a hammer." The opportunity Caesar sought came at Alesia, another hilltop fortress that Vercingetorix chose as the site for what both sides understood would be the decisive battle of the war. The Gallic leader had learned from Gergovia that static defense played to Roman strengths, but he had also recognized that his forces needed a secure base from which to coordinate their operations. Alesia seemed perfect for his purposes, a naturally strong position on a high plateau, surrounded by steep slopes that would make direct assault nearly impossible, provisioned for a long siege, and positioned to serve as a rallying point for relief armies from throughout Gaul. But Caesar had also learned from Gergovia, and his approach to the siege of Alesia would become a masterpiece of military engineering that demonstrated the full extent of Roman capabilities when properly applied. Instead of simply surrounding the fortress and waiting for starvation to force surrender, Caesar ordered the construction of two complete lines of fortifications, one facing inward toward Alesia to contain the garrison, and another facing outward to defend against the relief armies that would inevitably come to Vercingetorix's aid. The engineering involved was staggering in its scope and ambition. double walls, each 12 feet high and topped with sharpened stakes. Ditches filled with spikes and hidden traps. Artillery positions carefully sited to cover every approach. A defensive system so complete and sophisticated that it turned the besiegers into the besieged, trapping both the Gallic garrison and the Roman army in a contest of endurance that only one side could survive. Picture Caesar during those weeks of frantic construction, moving constantly along the growing fortifications, checking measurements with his engineers, consulting with his centurions about the placement of defensive obstacles. At 46, he had learned to delegate many responsibilities to subordinates, but this was too important to entrust to anyone else. The success or failure of the entire Gallic campaign would depend on whether these walls could hold when the storm finally broke. The siege of Alesia became a race against time, with both sides understanding that relief was coming, but uncertain whether it would arrive before starvation forced a decision. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix struggled to maintain morale among warriors who could see Roman earthworks growing stronger every day. Outside, Caesar worked to complete his preparations before the gathering armies of Gaul could overwhelm his positions through sheer numbers. When the relief force finally appeared on the horizon, it was everything Caesar had feared and more. A host so vast that it seemed to cover the landscape like a living carpet. Warriors from every corner of Gaul united in a final desperate attempt to preserve their freedom. Contemporary estimates put their numbers at over 200,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in the history of Celtic civilization. The final battle lasted 3 days and determined the fate of Western Europe for the next 5 centuries. Caesar, caught between the garrison of Alesia and the relief army, found himself fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, while trying to maintain the integrity of fortifications that represented his only hope of survival. On the first day, the Gauls tested Roman defenses with probing attacks that revealed the strength of Caesar's preparations, but also the determination of his enemies. On the second day, they launched coordinated assaults from multiple directions, trying to break through at the points where the double walls came closest together. But it was on the third day that the true test came, when Vercingetorix himself led a sortie from Alesia, while the relief army attacked from the opposite direction. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though Roman discipline might finally break under the pressure of fighting enemies who matched their courage with their own desperate determination. Caesar's personal intervention once again proved decisive. Seizing his red shield and mounting his white horse, the one he had ridden since his first day in Gaul, he led a cavalry charge that split the Gallic relief force at its crucial moment and turned their victory into rout. But perhaps the most significant moment of the entire siege came not during the heat of battle, but in its aftermath, when Vercingetorix made a decision that elevated him from defeated enemy to tragic hero. Recognizing that further resistance would only lead to the slaughter of his remaining followers, the young Gallic leader chose to surrender himself to save his people. Picture that scene as Caesar himself described it. The gates of Alesia opening to reveal a single horseman riding slowly down the hill toward the Roman lines. Vercingetorix had dressed in his finest armor for the occasion, bronze and gold that caught the afternoon sun like captured fire. A torque of twisted silver around his neck, his long hair bound with ornaments that spoke of nobility, earned rather than inherited. He rode to the center of the space between the armies, dismounted, and laid his weapons at Caesar's feet with the dignity of a king, acknowledging a superior force rather than a criminal confessing guilt. "I surrender myself to you," he said in Latin that carried only the slightest trace of Celtic accent, "not because I fear death, but because I would spare my people the consequences of my failure. I ask nothing for myself, but I ask everything for them, that you remember they followed me in good faith, believing that they fought for freedom rather than rebellion." Caesar's response would be remembered and debated by historians for centuries to come. Standing before the man who had come closer than any enemy to destroying his career and his army, he chose mercy over vengeance, respect over humiliation. "You have fought with honor," Caesar replied, his voice carrying clearly to both armies. "And honor recognizes honor, regardless of which gods it serves or which eagles it follows. Your people will be treated as allies who chose the wrong side rather than enemies who deserve destruction. You yourself will be held as surety for their good behavior, but you will be held with the dignity due to a worthy opponent. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked the end of organized resistance to Roman rule in Gaul, but it also marked the beginning of something else. Caesar's transformation from successful general to figure of mythic proportions. The man who had defeated the greatest coalition in Celtic history, who had turned apparent disaster into complete triumph, who had shown mercy to enemies and loyalty to allies, had proven himself capable of achievements that bordered on the superhuman. As winter settled over Gaul once again, and Caesar prepared to return to Rome for the first time in 8 years, he carried with him more than just the spoils of conquest. He carried the knowledge that he had accomplished something unprecedented in the annals of human history. The transformation of an entire civilization from barbarism to order, from chaos to law, from a collection of warring tribes to a unified province of the Roman Empire. But he also carried something else, something that would prove far more dangerous than any Gallic warrior or Germanic king. The absolute certainty that there was no limit to what a man could accomplish if he possessed sufficient will and wisdom to seize the opportunities that destiny placed before him. The boy from the Subura had become the conqueror of Gaul. But his greatest test still lay ahead, waiting in the marble halls of Rome, where his enemies had spent 8 years sharpening their knives and preparing to teach him that some ambitions come at a price that no man should be willing to pay. The river was small and unremarkable, barely worthy of the name, a thin ribbon of dark water that meandered through the marshy lowlands between Gaul and Italy like an afterthought of the gods. Fishermen worked its banks without ceremony, farmers watered their cattle from its shallows, and children played in its gentle current during the warm afternoons of summer. To most who encountered it, the Rubicon was simply another minor waterway in a landscape dotted with streams and brooks. But on this January morning in the year 49 BCE, as mist rose from its surface like the breath of sleeping spirits, the little river had become the most important boundary in the world, the line between republic and empire, between law and revolution, between the Rome that had been and the Rome that was about to be born in blood and ambition. Caesar stood on the northern bank, still technically within the borders of his Gallic province, his scarlet cloak dark with moisture from the pre-dawn air. At 51, he possessed the lean, weathered appearance of a man who had spent years in military camps, but his eyes retained the same intensity that had marked him since childhood, the look of someone who saw possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Behind him, arranged in the disciplined silence that marked veteran troops, stood the 13th Legion, 5,000 men who had followed him through 8 years of Gallic warfare, who had shared his victories and his dangers, who trusted him more completely than they trusted their own gods. They waited in the morning mist, like statues carved from iron and determination, ready to follow their general wherever he chose to lead them. Ahead lay Italy, and beyond Italy, Rome, the city of his birth, the seat of his ambitions, the stage upon which the final act of his life's drama would be performed. But between Caesar and his destiny flowed this insignificant stream that Roman law had invested with momentous significance. By crossing it with his army, he would be committing an act of treason that could only end in victory or death. Picture him in those final moments before the decision that would reshape the world, his mind racing through calculations that balanced personal survival against political necessity, immediate danger against ultimate opportunity. The reports from Rome had been growing more ominous with each passing month. His enemies in the Senate had finally moved openly against him, demanding his immediate return to face charges, stripping him of his command, making it clear that they intended to destroy him politically if they could not destroy him physically. Marcus Porcius Cato, that incorruptible voice of Republican tradition, had spent months preparing the legal groundwork for Caesar's prosecution. Cicero, ever the political opportunist, had aligned himself with the optimates who sought to preserve the old order against Caesar's innovations. Even Pompey, his former ally, his daughter's husband, his partner in the triumvirate that had once seemed unbreakable, had declared himself Caesar's enemy, chosen the Senate over their friendship, placed the preservation of his own position above the bonds that had united them. "They leave me no choice," Caesar said quietly, speaking more to himself than to the officers who stood nearby. "Return to Rome as a private citizen, and they will destroy me in the courts with trumped-up charges and perjured testimony. Remain in Gaul beyond my legal term, and they will declare me an enemy of the state. They offer me death or disgrace, as if those were the only options available to a man who has served Rome faithfully for 50 years. Gaius Asinius Pollio, the young senator who had joined Caesar's staff to observe the Gallic campaigns and stayed to become one of his most trusted advisors, shifted nervously in his saddle. Even at 25, Pollio possessed the kind of sharp political intelligence that allowed him to see the broader implications of this moment. "There is still time to negotiate," he offered, though his voice carried little conviction. "Perhaps if you agreed to certain limitations on your future activities, accepted some form of censure rather than prosecution." But Caesar's smile held no warmth, only the cold calculation of a man who had learned to read the hearts of enemies as easily as he read military maps. "My dear Pollio," he replied, his voice carrying the gentle tone he might have used to correct a student's faulty logic, "they are not interested in negotiation. They want my destruction, complete, public, and permanent. They have convinced themselves that I represent a threat to the Republic, and men who see themselves as protectors of tradition will go to any lengths to eliminate threats." He paused, his gaze fixed on the dark water that reflected the first pale light of dawn. "The irony is that they are right. I do represent a threat to their Republic, not because I seek to destroy it, but because I seek to fulfill the promise it has never been able to keep. They speak of tradition as if it were sacred, but their tradition has given us corruption disguised as virtue, incompetence disguised as wisdom, and a system so rigid that it cannot adapt to the realities of governing an empire." The decision, when it finally came, arrived not as a dramatic moment of revelation, but as the quiet recognition of something that had been inevitable since the day Caesar first marched north to face the Helvetii. The boy who had once pressed his ear to the bronze doors of the Senate House had always known that ordinary life would never be sufficient for his ambitions. The man who had conquered Gaul and defeated Vercingetorix understood that there could be no retreat from the destiny he had been building toward all his life. "Signal the engineers," Caesar commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had moved legions and toppled kingdoms. "Prepare the crossing." The operation that followed was a masterpiece of military efficiency, executed with the precision that had become the hallmark of Caesar's campaigns. Pontoon bridges appeared as if by magic, their wooden spans reaching across the Rubicon, like fingers extended in greeting to whatever fate awaited on the southern bank. The 13th Legion crossed in perfect formation, their hobnailed sandals striking the temporary planking in rhythm with drums that beat the cadence of revolution. But perhaps the most significant moment of the entire crossing came when Caesar himself finally stepped onto the bridge, his scarlet cloak billowing in the morning breeze, his face set in the expression of absolute determination that his soldiers knew meant victory or death. "Alia iacta est," he said quietly, speaking the words that would echo through history like thunder across a battlefield. "The die is cast." It was a gambler's phrase, chosen by a man who had spent his life taking calculated risks for enormous stakes. But there was nothing of chance in Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon. It was the logical conclusion of a career built on the principle that audacity, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle that tradition or law might place in the path of a determined man. The news of Caesar's march on Rome spread through Italy like wildfire, carried by merchants and messengers who understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented in Roman history. For the first time since the city's founding, a Roman general was leading a Roman army against Rome itself, not as a foreign invader seeking conquest, but as a citizen demanding his rights under threat of force. The response was immediate and dramatic. In town after town, local magistrates faced impossible choices as Caesar's advance guard appeared at their gates with demands for surrender. Some chose resistance, others accommodation, but most simply fled, abandoning their positions rather than face the consequences of choosing the wrong side in a conflict whose outcome remained uncertain. Pompey, the great general who had once been Caesar's ally and remained his most dangerous enemy, found himself caught completely off guard by the speed and audacity of his opponent's advance. The defensive preparations he had been making assumed that any civil war would develop slowly, giving him time to mobilize the resources of the eastern provinces where his influence was strongest. Instead, he discovered that Caesar was moving with the kind of lightning speed that had characterized his Gallic campaigns, striking before his enemies could organize effective resistance, winning through momentum what he might have lost through prolonged conflict. Picture the scene in Rome during those frantic days as news arrived of Caesar's unstoppable advance. Senators fleeing the city with whatever portable wealth they could carry, citizens gathering in the forum to debate whether Caesar came as liberator or conqueror, slaves and freedmen whispering that perhaps the old order was finally crumbling and something new was about to be born. Cato, that stern voice of Republican virtue, delivered one final speech to the nearly empty Senate House, his words echoing from marble walls that had heard the wisdom of Cicero and the thunder of the great orators of the past. "We stand at the end of an age," he declared, his austere figure rigid with the certainty that had sustained him through a lifetime of political struggle. "The republic our ancestors built with their blood and wisdom is dying, killed not by foreign enemies, but by our own failure to remain worthy of the legacy they left us. If Caesar triumphs, if the principle of might over right is allowed to stand, then we will have learned that no constitution is stronger than the ambitions of the men who live under it." But even as Cato spoke with prophetic clarity about the death of the old order, the streets of Rome were beginning to fill with citizens who had come not to mourn the republic's passing, but to welcome whatever Caesar might offer in its place. These were the people whose voices had been ignored by the Senate's debates, whose needs had been overlooked in the complex maneuvering of aristocratic politics, the urban poor, the veterans of foreign wars, the freedmen and slaves who made up the vast majority of Rome's population. To them, Caesar represented not the destroyer of tradition, but its fulfillment, the strong man who could provide the security and prosperity that the Republic's endless debates had failed to deliver. They remembered his games as Aedile, his clemency as Pontifex Maximus, his victories in Gaul that had filled Rome's treasury and enhanced its glory. When they looked at the approaching army, they saw not invaders, but liberators. The first major test of Caesar's clemency came at Corfinium, where one of his former lieutenants, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, had gathered a small force to resist the invasion. The siege was brief, and the outcome inevitable, but its aftermath would be remembered long after the tactical details were forgotten. Standing before the captured garrison, Caesar faced the same choice that had confronted every Roman general throughout history when dealing with fellow citizens who had chosen the wrong side in civil war. Tradition demanded execution or enslavement, the kind of harsh justice that would serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to resist. Instead, Caesar chose something unprecedented: complete forgiveness. "You are Romans," he told the assembled prisoners, his voice carrying clearly to every man in the defeated force. "You chose to oppose me not from malice, but from conscience, believing that you served the greater good. I honor that conscience even as I reject the conclusions it led you to reach. Return to your homes, resume your lives, and judge for yourselves whether the Rome I build is worthy of the loyalty you showed to the Rome you sought to preserve." The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Word of Caesar's mercy spread through Italy faster than his legions could march, creating a momentum of goodwill that made further resistance seem both futile and unnecessary. Town after town opened its gates without a fight, welcoming Caesar not as a conqueror, but as a leader whose victory promised justice rather than vengeance. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Corfinium was its effect on Caesar himself. The man who had spent 8 years learning to rule barbarians through a combination of force and diplomacy discovered that the same principles could be applied to ruling Romans. Mercy was not just morally superior to brutality, it was tactically more effective, creating allies rather than martyrs, building loyalty rather than resentment. By the time Caesar reached the outskirts of Rome itself, barely 2 months after crossing the Rubicon, he commanded not just an army but a movement. The city that had seemed so formidable from the far side of a small river now lay before him like a prize waiting to be claimed by whoever possessed sufficient will to seize it. Standing on the hills that overlooked the eternal city, Caesar could see the smoke rising from a million hearthfires, could hear the distant murmur of voices from the forum where his fate had been debated for so many years. Somewhere beyond those walls lay the house in the Subura where he had been born, the temples where he had served as priest, the Senate house where he had first learned to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman politics. But the boy who had grown up in those narrow streets was gone, replaced by something the city had never seen before, a Roman who commanded the loyalty of Romans through achievement rather than birth, through merit rather than tradition, through vision rather than preservation of ancient forms. "Send word ahead," Caesar commanded, as his army prepared for the final advance. "Tell the citizens of Rome that their son has come home, not as their master, but as their servant. Tell them that the boy from the Subura remembers where he came from, and will never forget the people who made him what he is." The gates of Rome opened without resistance, and Caesar entered his birthplace for the first time in 9 years, not as a private citizen seeking office, but as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The crossing of the Rubicon had ended more than just his legal command in Gaul. It had ended the Roman Republic itself, though few yet understood the full implications of what had just transpired. As evening fell over the 7 hills, and Caesar took up residence in the house that had once belonged to Pompey, his former ally, his defeated enemy, the man who had fled to the east to gather forces for the final confrontation that still lay ahead. He found himself facing a solitude that no amount of victory could fill. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of since childhood: command of Roman armies, control of Roman resources, the power to reshape the world according to his vision. But he had also discovered something that the boy from the Subura could never have imagined: that ultimate success could be the loneliest achievement in human experience. Somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, Pompey was gathering the forces that would make civil war inevitable. Somewhere in Africa, Cato and the other Republican diehards were preparing for battles that would drench the ancient world in blood. The crossing of the Rubicon had been only the beginning of a conflict that would determine whether the future belonged to the old ways or the new vision that Caesar carried in his mind like a sacred flame. But for tonight, in the quiet of a house that had once echoed with laughter and friendship, Caesar allowed himself a moment of reflection on the path that had brought him to this pinnacle of power and responsibility. The die had been cast, the river had been crossed, and there could be no turning back from whatever destiny awaited on the far shore of tomorrow. The lighthouse of Alexandria rose from the harbor like a titan of white marble and bronze, its beacon visible from 20 miles at sea, its shadow falling across a city that had been the jewel of the Mediterranean since Alexander the Great had dreamed it into existence 3 centuries before. As Caesar's ship approached the ancient port in the autumn of 48 BCE, he could see the palace of the Ptolemies, gleaming on its artificial island, connected to the mainland by a causeway that seemed to bridge not just water, but time itself. He was 52 now, and the previous months had aged him in ways that years of Gallic warfare had not. The civil war that had begun with his crossing of the Rubicon had culminated in victory at Pharsalus, where Pompey's legions had broken before the disciplined advance of Caesar's veterans. But victory had brought its own burdens, and the man who now controlled the Roman world found himself pursuing his defeated rival to this ancient land, where pharaohs had once ruled as living gods. Picture Caesar as he stood at the ship's rail, his scarlet cloak whipping in the Mediterranean breeze, his eyes fixed on a city that represented everything Rome had never quite managed to become. Alexandria was more than just a port. It was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the greatest library in human history, a place where scholars from every known civilization gathered to push the boundaries of human knowledge. But it was also a tomb, the resting place of Alexander himself, whose preserved body lay in a crystal sarcophagus that had become a pilgrimage site for generals and kings who sought to touch something of his divine genius. Caesar had come to Egypt pursuing Pompey, but he found himself drawn by something deeper, the possibility of communion with greatness that transcended the petty politics of Republican Rome. The news that greeted him at the harbor was both welcome and troubling. Pompey was dead, murdered by agents of the young Pharaoh Ptolemy III as he stepped ashore 3 days earlier. The great general, who had once been Caesar's ally and rival, lay buried in a shallow grave on a beach east of the city, his head preserved in brine as a gift for the man who had defeated him. When the Egyptians presented this grisly trophy to Caesar, expecting gratitude for their efficiency in eliminating his enemy, they discovered that the Roman concept of honor was more complex than they had anticipated. Caesar took one look at the severed head, still recognizable despite the preservation process, still bearing traces of the nobility that had made Pompey one of Rome's greatest commanders, and wept. "Are you fools?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that his veterans had learned to fear more than his loudest rage. "You have robbed me of the chance to show mercy to a brave enemy, and you have dishonored yourselves by murdering a guest who came to you seeking sanctuary. This is not victory. This is barbarism disguised as expediency." The Egyptian officials who had orchestrated Pompey's death suddenly found themselves regretting their initiative. They had hoped to curry favor with the victor of the civil war by eliminating his rival. But Caesar's reaction made clear that they had misunderstood both the man and the situation. But if Caesar was troubled by the manner of Pompey's death, he was fascinated by the political situation he discovered in Alexandria. Egypt, that ancient kingdom that had survived the conquests of Persians and Macedonians, was being torn apart by a civil war of its own, a struggle between the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his older sister Cleopatra VII for control of the richest prize in the Mediterranean world, Cleopatra. Even her name seemed to carry magic, a combination of syllables that whispered of mystery and power, of beauty that had toppled kingdoms and wisdom that had confounded philosophers. At 21, she was already a legend in her own time, the last direct descendant of Alexander's general Ptolemy, heir to 3 centuries of Hellenistic learning, ruler of a land that had been ancient when Rome was still a collection of mud huts on 7 insignificant hills. But she was also a refugee, driven from her throne by a brother husband, whose supporters controlled the army and the treasury, while she commanded little more than her own intelligence and the loyalty of a few hundred followers who believed in her divine right to rule. The manner of her approach to Caesar became one of the great romantic stories of the ancient world, though those who witnessed it understood that romance was merely the wrapping around a core of pure political calculation. Unable to enter Alexandria openly, due to her brother's control of the city, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, wrapped in a carpet that was presented as a gift from one of the merchants who traded throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Picture that moment as Caesar himself described it, in letters that would survive long after the participants had crumbled to dust. The unrolling of what appeared to be a simple floor covering, only to reveal a young woman who seemed to embody everything the poets had ever written about divine beauty made manifest in human form. But it was not Cleopatra's appearance that captivated Caesar, though that was stunning enough to make seasoned soldiers forget their duties, but her mind. Within minutes of their first conversation, he realized that he was facing an intelligence that matched his own, a political sophistication that had been refined through generations of Ptolemaic statecraft, a vision of power that transcended the petty squabbles of tribal politics. "So," she said in Latin that carried only the slightest trace of Greek accent, her dark eyes studying Caesar with the same intensity he had seen in his own reflection, "you are the famous Caesar. The man who conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, and made himself master of Rome. Tell me, what brings you to Egypt? Are you here as tourist, conqueror, or ally?" The directness of the question, delivered with the kind of royal authority that acknowledged no superior on earth, delighted Caesar in ways he had not expected. Here was someone who spoke to him as an equal, rather than a suppliant, who seemed genuinely curious about his intentions rather than simply terrified by his reputation. "I came pursuing an enemy," Caesar replied honestly, "but I find myself intrigued by the possibility of making a friend. Egypt is too important to Rome, and too fascinating in its own right, to be governed by anyone less than extraordinary. The question is whether you are as capable as you are beautiful, and whether your vision of the future is as grand as your heritage suggests." What followed was less a negotiation than a meeting of minds that had been shaped by similar experiences of power and responsibility. Both had been born to privilege, but forced to fight for their inheritance. Both understood that survival in the treacherous waters of high politics required a combination of ruthlessness and mercy, of vision and pragmatism, of the ability to inspire loyalty, while never forgetting that loyalty could be withdrawn as easily as it was given. The alliance they forged that night was sealed not just by political calculation, but by genuine attraction, the recognition of kindred spirits who had finally found someone capable of understanding the loneliness that came with ultimate responsibility. But their partnership faced immediate challenges. Ptolemy Thene's supporters, learning of Cleopatra's return and her alliance with Caesar, launched an attack on the palace quarter that turned Alexandria into a battlefield. For months, Caesar found himself trapped in one of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world, fighting a siege that tested every lesson he had learned about urban warfare. The fighting was unlike anything Caesar had experienced in Gaul or during the Civil War. Alexandria was a maze of marble corridors and hidden passages, of libraries that doubled as fortresses and temples that concealed military supplies. The Egyptian royal guard fought with the desperation of men defending not just a regime, but a civilization that stretched back to the time of the pyramids. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Alexandrine War was the role played by Cleopatra herself. Far from remaining safely in the background while men fought for her throne, she proved herself to be as capable a military commander as she was a political strategist. Caesar's dispatches from this period speak with admiration of her courage under fire, her strategic insights, and her ability to inspire loyalty among troops who had served her family for generations. Picture them during those long nights when the siege lines settled into temporary quiet, standing together on the palace balconies that overlooked the harbor where Alexander's tomb gleamed in the moonlight. Two of the most powerful people in the ancient world, thrown together by circumstance but united by choice, planning not just the defense of a city, but the shape of the future they hoped to build together. "Rome and Egypt," Cleopatra said during one of these conversations, her voice carrying the dreamy quality that came with exhaustion and possibility, "could rule the world as partners rather than as master and servant. Your legions combined with our wealth, your administration combined with our learning, your vision combined with our ancient wisdom, there would be no limit to what we could accomplish." Caesar, studying the woman who had become both his lover and his strategic partner, found himself contemplating possibilities that would have seemed like fantasy just months before. Egypt's wealth was legendary. Its position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe made it the key to controlling Mediterranean trade, and its intellectual traditions offered resources that Rome had never been able to develop on its own. But more than that, Cleopatra represented something that Caesar had been searching for throughout his career. A partnership of equals, a meeting of minds that could transcend the limitations of purely Roman thinking. With her beside him, he could envision an empire that stretched from Britain to Ethiopia, from Spain to India, a realm that would make Alexander's conquests seem like the raiding expeditions of ambitious barbarians. The siege of Alexandria finally ended, not through military victory, but through the arrival of reinforcements that shifted the balance of power decisively in Caesar and Cleopatra's favor. The young pharaoh, seeing his cause hopeless, attempted to flee by ship, but drowned in the Nile when his vessel capsized during a storm that seemed to carry the judgment of the gods themselves. With her brother rival dead and Caesar's legions controlling the city, Cleopatra was restored to her throne as the undisputed ruler of Egypt. But the crown she received was different from the one she had lost. Instead of ruling as the isolated monarch of an ancient kingdom, she now reigned as the partner of Rome's master, her authority backed by Roman legions, but exercised according to Egyptian traditions. The months that followed were among the happiest of Caesar's life. Freed from the immediate pressures of military campaigning and political maneuvering, he was able to explore aspects of Egyptian civilization that had fascinated him since childhood. He sailed up the Nile with Cleopatra, visiting temples that had been ancient when Romulus and Remus were still suckling their legendary wolf. At Memphis, he stood before the Sphinx and contemplated the inscriptions that recorded deeds performed when the world was young. At Thebes, he walked through the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs lay in tombs more magnificent than anything Rome had ever constructed. At the Great Pyramid, he marveled at engineering that seemed to transcend human capability, wondering what knowledge had been lost in the centuries since its construction. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Caesar's Egyptian sojourn was its effect on his understanding of what it meant to rule an empire that encompassed multiple civilizations. Rome had always approached conquest as a process of replacement, Roman law superseding local customs, Roman gods displacing native beliefs, Roman administrative methods overriding traditional systems of governance. Egypt taught him a different model, synthesis rather than replacement, accommodation rather than domination, the preservation of what was valuable in conquered cultures rather than the wholesale imposition of Roman uniformity. Under Cleopatra's guidance, he began to envision an empire that could be truly universal, not just Roman territory extended over foreign peoples, but a new form of civilization that combined the best elements of every culture it encompassed. When news finally reached Alexandria that his presence was urgently required elsewhere, that enemies in Africa and Spain were gathering forces that could threaten his still fragile control of the Roman world, Caesar found himself reluctant to leave the paradise he had discovered on the banks of the Nile. But duty called, and Caesar had never been a man to ignore responsibility for the sake of personal pleasure. The departure scene, played out on the harbor where he had first arrived as a pursuer of enemies, carried an emotional weight that surprised both participants. "I will return," Caesar promised as he prepared to board the ship that would carry him back to the harsher realities of Roman politics. "Egypt has become part of me in ways I could never have anticipated, and I cannot imagine ruling Rome without the wisdom I have learned here." Cleopatra, standing on the quay with the morning sun turning her golden diadem into a crown of fire, smiled with the confidence of a woman who understood that some bonds, once forged, could never be broken by mere distance. "When you return," she replied, "you will find Egypt unchanged in all the ways that matter, wealthy, wise, and waiting for the day when our partnership can reshape the world according to the vision we have shared." As Caesar's ship disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying him back toward conflicts that would determine the fate of his empire, Cleopatra remained on the harbor, one hand resting on her abdomen where Caesar's child was beginning to grow. The future she carried within her womb would unite the bloodlines of Alexander and Augustus, creating possibilities that neither the Macedonian conqueror nor the Roman dictator could have imagined. But that future still lay hidden in the realm of potential. For now, Caesar sailed westward toward battles that would test everything he had learned about the nature of power and the price of greatness. The boy from the Subura had become the lover of pharaohs, but his greatest trials still awaited him in the marble halls of Rome, where enemies and allies alike were preparing for the final act of a drama that had begun with a small boy pressing his ear to bronze doors and dreaming of glory. Rome in the spring of 44 BCE was a city transformed, its ancient streets echoing with the sound of construction and the voices of people from every corner of the known world. Egyptian architects worked alongside Germanic craftsmen, Gallic merchants traded with Spanish shipwrights, and African scholars debated philosophy with Greek poets in the colonnades of temples that had been rebuilt to accommodate the diverse spiritual needs of an empire that now stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. At the center of it all, like a spider in a web of his own weaving, sat Gaius Julius Caesar, Dictator Perpetuo, Pontifex Maximus, Imperator, and a dozen other titles that failed to capture the reality of what he had become. At 56, he possessed a presence that filled any room he entered, a combination of intellectual authority and physical charisma that made even his enemies acknowledge his extraordinary capabilities. But power, Caesar had discovered, was like water. The more you gathered, the harder it became to hold without something slipping through your fingers. The empire he had built through 8 years of Gallic warfare and 5 years of civil conflict was secure from external threats, but internal dangers seemed to multiply with each passing day. Picture him in his study in the house that had once belonged to Pompey, surrounded by maps that showed the extent of his conquests and scrolls that detailed the administrative reforms he was implementing throughout the Roman world. The room was lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with treasures from a dozen conquered kingdoms, Celtic torques from Gaul, Germanic amber from beyond the Rhine, Egyptian gold from the tombs of pharaohs, pearls from the coasts of Britain. But perhaps the most significant item in the room was a small bust of Alexander the Great, positioned where Caesar could see it from his desk. The Macedonian conqueror had died at 33, master of an empire that stretched from Macedonia to India, but had failed to create institutions capable of surviving his death. Caesar, already 23 years older than Alexander had been at his death, was determined not to repeat that mistake. The reforms he was implementing were unprecedented in their scope and vision. Roman citizenship was being extended to conquered peoples throughout Gaul and Spain. The calendar was being reformed to reflect astronomical reality rather than political convenience. Public works projects were transforming Rome from a city of narrow streets and crowded tenements into something worthy of its position as the capital of the world. Most controversially, Caesar was actively promoting men from the provinces to positions of authority in Roman government. Gauls sat in the Senate alongside descendants of the city's founding families. Germans commanded auxiliary units that had once been led exclusively by Italian officers. Spaniards and Africans held magistracies that had traditionally been reserved for men whose ancestors had fought at Cannae and Zama. "Look at this," Caesar said to Marcus Antonius, his loyal lieutenant, his designated heir, the man who had stood by him through every campaign since the crossing of the Rubicon as they reviewed the latest reports from provincial governors. "A generation ago, these men would have been our enemies or our slaves. Today, they are our partners in the great work of civilizing the world." Antonius, sprawled in a chair with the casual elegance that marked him as a member of Rome's old aristocracy, studied the documents with the kind of practical intelligence that had made him Caesar's most trusted subordinate. At 40, he possessed the robust physicality of a career soldier, combined with the political sophistication necessary to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman high society. "The old families don't like it," he observed, his voice carrying a note of warning that Caesar had learned to respect. "Cato's friends may be dead or in exile, but their sons are still here, still nursing grievances, still dreaming of the day when they can restore the republic their fathers claimed to serve." Caesar paused in his reading, his dark eyes fixing on his lieutenant with the intensity that had made him such an effective interrogator of captured enemies. At 56, he had learned to read the subtle indicators that separated temporary opposition from existential threats, and what Antonius was describing sounded uncomfortably like the latter. "Specific names?" he asked quietly. "Marcus Junius Brutus heads the list. Gaius Cassius Longinus, Decimus Brutus, though that one hurts considering how close he's been to you. Maybe 20 others, all from old families, all convinced that you represent everything wrong with the direction Rome has taken." The name that hit Caesar hardest was that of Marcus Brutus, the young senator whose mother, Servilia, had been Caesar's lover for years, whose philosophical principles Caesar had always respected, even when they led to political disagreement. Brutus claimed descent from the legendary founder of the Roman Republic, the man who had expelled the last king and established the system of government that Caesar's enemies accused him of destroying. "Brutus," Caesar said softly, the name carrying a weight of personal betrayal that surprised him with its intensity. "I had hoped that he, of all people, would understand what we're trying to accomplish. The republic he claims to defend never really existed. It was always dominated by a small group of families who used tradition to justify their monopoly on power. What I'm building is the democracy the Republic promised, but never delivered. But even as Caesar spoke of his democratic ideals, he was acutely aware of the contradictions inherent in his position. He ruled alone, making decisions that affected millions of people without consulting anyone but a small circle of advisors. His will was law throughout the empire. His commands were obeyed without question. His displeasure could mean death or exile for even the most prominent citizens. The title he had accepted just months before, Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for Life, formalized what had already been the reality of his position, but it also provided his enemies with the symbolic focus they needed to organize opposition. A dictator appointed for a specific crisis could be tolerated as a temporary necessity. A dictator for life was a king in all but name, and Romans had been killing kings since the foundation of their city. The warnings came from multiple sources, each more urgent than the last. Calpurnia, his wife, reported dreams of violence and death, nightmares in which she saw Caesar's blood staining the floor of the Senate House. Spurinna, the soothsayer whose predictions had proven accurate in the past, warned of danger associated with the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, when certain religious festivals were traditionally celebrated. Most troubling of all were the reports from Caesar's network of informants, men and women throughout Rome, who kept him informed of conversations in private houses, meetings in public spaces, the subtle indicators that suggested coordinated opposition rather than random dissatisfaction. They're planning something. Lucius Cornelius Balbus, Caesar's private secretary and one of his most trusted advisors, reported during a confidential meeting held in the pre-dawn darkness when the city's streets were empty of everything but shadows and possibility. The exact details remain unclear, but the pattern is unmistakable. Too many private meetings, too many hushed conversations that stop when loyalists approach, too many senators asking casual questions about your schedule and security arrangements. Caesar listened to this intelligence with the calm attention he had always brought to military briefings, but those who knew him best could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the surface of his desk in the rhythm that marked moments when he was calculating odds and considering options. At 56, he had survived too many assassination attempts to dismiss such warnings as mere paranoia. The daggers that had missed him in Gaul, the poisoned wine that loyal servants had detected before it reached his lips, the accidents that careful preparation had allowed him to avoid, all had taught him that power made you a target for anyone who believed they could gain something from your death. But Caesar had also learned something else during his years of wielding absolute authority, that a leader who lived in constant fear of assassination would eventually be paralyzed by his own security measures. At some point, you had to choose between being safe and being effective, between protecting your life and living it in a manner worthy of the responsibilities you had assumed. "Double the Praetorian Guard," he commanded finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had moved legions and toppled kingdoms. "But do it discreetly. I don't want Rome to think their dictator is cowering behind a wall of spears. Increase surveillance on the senators Antonius mentioned, but make sure they don't realize they're being watched. And..." He paused, his mind racing through calculations that balanced personal safety against political necessity. "Schedule a meeting with Brutus. If he's truly involved in this conspiracy, perhaps I can convince him that his energy would be better directed toward building the future rather than preserving the past." The meeting with Marcus Brutus took place in Caesar's private garden, where spring flowers bloomed among carefully tended herbs, and the sound of flowing water from an ornamental fountain provided cover for conversations that could not be overheard by casual listeners. It was a setting designed to promote intimate discussion, but both men understood that they were really conducting a form of diplomatic negotiation between opposing worldviews. Brutus arrived wearing the simple toga that marked him as a man more concerned with philosophy than fashion, his thin face bearing the kind of serious expression that suggested he took his responsibilities as a descendant of the Republic's founder very seriously indeed. At 35, He possessed the intellectual intensity of someone who had spent years studying the great questions of governance and morality. But his dark eyes held shadows that spoke of internal conflicts Caesar found troubling. "Walk with me," Caesar said, leading his guest along paths that wound between rose bushes and olive trees, speaking with the casual tone he might have used to discuss the weather. "I've been thinking about legacy lately, what we leave behind when our time comes to an end. Alexander conquered the world but left chaos. Augustus built an empire but failed to create institutions that could outlast his personal authority. I hope to do better." Brutus listened with the careful attention of someone trying to understand not just the words but the intentions behind them. When he finally responded, his voice carried the kind of measured cadence that marked him as a product of the finest philosophical education available in the ancient world. "Legacy is indeed important," he agreed, "but so is legitimacy. A ruler's achievements mean nothing if they come at the cost of the principles that make civilization possible. The Republic may have been imperfect, but it represented something valuable, the idea that no single man should hold absolute power over the lives and destinies of other men." Caesar smiled, recognizing in Brutus's words the echo of debates he had heard in the Forum decades earlier, when he was still young enough to believe that political problems could be solved through rational discussion and good intentions. "The Republic you defend never actually existed," he replied gently. What Rome had was an oligarchy that used republican language to disguise aristocratic control. The people had votes but no real voice, rights but no real power. What I'm building may look like monarchy, but it serves democratic purposes better than the system it replaced. The conversation that followed lasted for hours, two intelligent men exploring the fundamental questions of governance and authority that had puzzled philosophers since Plato first imagined his ideal state. They discussed the nature of justice, the proper relationship between ruler and ruled, the tension between individual freedom and collective security that lay at the heart of every political system. But underneath the philosophical debate, both men understood that they were really negotiating the terms of a personal relationship that had become impossible to maintain. Brutus believed with the fervor of a true convert that Caesar represented a mortal threat to everything valuable in Roman civilization. Caesar believed with equal conviction that Brutus was clinging to illusions about a past that had never been as noble as its defenders claimed. When they finally parted, with the sun setting behind the 7 hills and the first stars appearing in a sky that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, both men knew that they had failed to bridge the gap that separated them. Caesar watched Brutus walk away with something approaching sorrow, understanding that he had just lost one of the few people in Rome whose intellectual honesty he genuinely respected. That night, alone in his study with only the bust of Alexander for company, Caesar found himself contemplating the price that greatness exacted from those who pursued it. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of since childhood: command of armies, control of the state, the power to reshape the world according to his vision. But those achievements had cost him almost every personal relationship he valued, transforming friends into enemies and allies into threats. The reports that reached him over the following days painted an increasingly disturbing picture of coordinated opposition. Brutus was indeed at the center of a conspiracy that included some of Rome's most prominent senators, men whose families had served the state for generations, but who now saw Caesar as a tyrant who needed to be eliminated for the good of the Republic. The irony was not lost on him. The same men who had benefited most from the system he was trying to reform were the ones most determined to preserve it through violence. They spoke of honor and tradition while planning murder, of liberty and justice while plotting tyrannicide, of service to the state while preparing to plunge it into civil war. The date they had chosen for their attempt was the Ides of March, the day when Caesar was scheduled to address the Senate before departing for a campaign against the Parthians, the Eastern Empire that represented the last major threat to Roman dominance in the Mediterranean world. It would be his final appearance in Rome before what was expected to be a years-long absence, making it the perfect opportunity for those who believed his death could restore the Republic. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar woke before dawn with the strange sense of anticipation that had marked every crucial moment of his life. Standing at his bedroom window, watching the first pale light creep across the rooftops of the city he had transformed, he felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Calpurnia begged him not to go to the Senate that day, her pleas growing more desperate as she described the nightmares that had plagued her sleep, visions of blood and betrayal, of her husband lying dead on marble floors while his enemies stood over him with daggers still dripping. But Caesar, who had spent his life defying odds that would have paralyzed lesser men, refused to be governed by superstition or fear. "If I die today," he told her with the gentle firmness that had characterized all his most important decisions, "I die as Caesar, as the man who conquered Gaul, who crossed the Rubicon, who made Rome the master of the world. That is legacy enough for any mortal, and more than most men dare to dream." The journey to the Senate House took him through streets he had known since childhood, past buildings that had witnessed his transformation from ambitious boy to master of the world. Citizens lined the route to catch a glimpse of their dictator, some calling out blessings, others simply staring in silent awe at the man who had become legend in his own lifetime. As his litter approached the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day in a building named for his former ally and greatest rival, Caesar noticed the soothsayer Spurina standing among the crowd. Their eyes met across the distance that separated ruler from subject, and the old prophet's expression carried a weight of prophecy that made Caesar's blood run cold. "The Ides of March have come," Caesar called out, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise of the crowd. "Aye," Spurina replied, his words seeming to hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "They have come, but they have not yet passed." The Senate House was crowded with men wearing the white togas that marked their senatorial rank, their faces wearing expressions of carefully controlled anticipation. Caesar took his seat in the curule chair that had been placed at the front of the chamber, symbol of the authority that had made him master of the world, but had also made him the target of those who believed that no man should possess such power. The session began with routine business, reports from provincial governors, discussions of administrative matters, the kind of mundane concerns that occupied most of the Senate's time. But Caesar, with the instincts honed by decades of political warfare, could sense the tension in the room, the way conversations stopped when he looked in certain directions, the manner in which some senators avoided meeting his eyes. When Tullius Cimber approached to present a petition on behalf of his exiled brother, Caesar initially assumed it was just another routine request for clemency. But as Cimber knelt beside the dictator's chair, ostensibly to plead more effectively for his brother's pardon, other senators began to move closer, Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, and others, whose names would echo through history as the liberators who killed a tyrant or the traitors who murdered the father of their country. The first blow came from behind, a dagger thrust between Caesar's shoulder blades that sent shockwaves of pain and surprise through his body. He spun around to face his attacker, his soldier's instincts still strong despite his 56 years, and found himself looking into the face of Casca, a man he had considered an ally whose family had benefited from Caesar's patronage. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter, as more than 20 men pressed forward with daggers drawn, each wanting to strike a blow that would make him a participant in the tyrant's death rather than merely a witness to it. Caesar fought back with the desperation of a cornered animal, his hands grasping for weapons that weren't there, his voice calling for help that would not come. But the moment that broke his spirit came when he saw Brutus among his attackers, the young man he had loved like a son, raising a dagger with the same philosophical deliberation he brought to every important decision. The physical pain of the wounds was nothing compared to the emotional agony of that betrayal, the recognition that even those he had trusted most completely had turned against him. "Et tu, Brute?" The words escaped his lips like a prayer or a curse, carrying 20 years of affection and disappointment, of hopes shared and trust betrayed. Then fall Caesar must. And with that acknowledgement of the inevitable, the man who had conquered Gaul defeated Pompey and made himself master of the Roman world pulled his toga over his head, and submitted to the will of men who believed they were saving the Republic by destroying its greatest servant. When the daggers finally stopped falling, when the last of the conspirators had struck his symbolic blow, Julius Caesar lay dead at the foot of Pompey's statue, an irony that would have amused him if he had lived to appreciate it. The man who had once been his greatest rival now presided in marble silence over his final defeat, as if the gods had scripted this ending with an attention to dramatic detail that would have impressed the greatest playwrights. The senators fled the blood-soaked chamber in panic, leaving behind the body of the man who had transformed their world but had never succeeded in transforming their hearts. In the sudden silence that followed the assassination, with dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that illuminated the spreading pool of blood, the Roman Republic died, as surely as the dictator who had been trying to preserve it through radical reform. Outside in the streets of Rome, word of Caesar's death spread like wildfire through a city that had known him as conqueror, reformer, and patron. Citizens who had cheered his victories and benefited from his generosity gathered in the forum to demand answers, their voices rising in a chorus of grief and rage that would soon transform into something far more dangerous. The conspirators had succeeded in killing Caesar, but they had failed to kill what Caesar represented: the promise of a world where greatness was rewarded regardless of birth, where merit mattered more than tradition, where the future mattered more than the past. That promise would survive in the hearts of those who remembered the boy from the Subura, who had dreamed of glory and had achieved it through courage, intelligence, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of human greatness. The die had been cast, the Rubicon had been crossed, and the Ides of March had indeed come and gone. But the legacy of Julius Caesar would prove more enduring than marble statues or bronze inscriptions, more powerful than the daggers of assassins or the schemes of politicians who mistook murder for statesmanship. In death, Caesar would achieve the immortality that had eluded him in life, his name becoming synonymous with imperial authority, his example inspiring generations of leaders who would seek to match his achievements while avoiding his fate. The boy, who had once pressed his ear to the bronze doors of the Senate House, had become the man whose blood would stain those doors forever, but whose vision would outlive all the conspirators who had sought to kill it along with its creator. In the stillness that follows the end of all stories, when the last echo of footsteps has faded from marble halls and the final words have been spoken in voices that will never speak again, something remains. Not the man, that flesh and blood and brilliant mind that had walked the earth for 56 years, but something larger, more enduring, more mysterious than mortality could ever contain. Picture Rome in the hours after the assassination, as news of Caesar's death spread through streets that had known his footsteps since childhood. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if the very stones understood that they had witnessed not just the end of a life, but the end of an age, the moment when the Republic finally gave way to empire, when the old world died to make room for something unprecedented in human history. In his modest house in the Subura, where an old woman who had been his wet nurse sat spinning wool by the light of an oil lamp, the first tears fell for the baby she had once held in her arms. She remembered him not as the dictator who had commanded legions or the conqueror who had subdued nations, but as the curious child who had asked endless questions about the world beyond their narrow streets. He was always reaching for something, she whispered to the empty room, her gnarled hands pausing in their work. Even as a baby, his fingers would stretch toward things he couldn't quite grasp, as if he knew there was more to life than what the rest of us could see. In Alexandria, where the lighthouse still cast its beacon across waters that had carried Caesar's ships to their Egyptian destiny, Cleopatra received the news with the composure of a pharaoh who had learned that queens do not weep in public, no matter how their hearts might break in private. But that night in the royal chambers where she had shared Caesar's dreams of an empire that would unite East and West, she held their son Caesarion close and whispered stories of his father's greatness. "Remember this," she told the boy who carried Caesar's blood and her ambitions in equal measure. "Your father was more than a man. He was an idea made flesh, a vision of what humanity could become if it dared to dream beyond the boundaries that tradition had set. They killed his body, but they cannot kill what he represented. In Gaul, where Druids had once predicted the coming of a foreign conqueror who would change everything, veterans of Caesar's campaigns gathered around campfires that flickered like distant stars in the darkness. These were men who had followed him across rivers and through forests, who had shared his dangers and his triumphs, who had learned to see themselves not as barbarians or subjects, but as partners in a great enterprise that had transformed the world. "He made us Romans," an old Aedui warrior said, his scarred hands warming themselves at the fire's glow, "not by forcing us to forget who we were, but by showing us who we could become. That is a gift that does not die with the giver." But perhaps the most significant response to Caesar's assassination came not from those who had loved him, but from those who had killed him. In the hours and days that followed the Ides of March, as the conspirators discovered that the republic they thought they were saving was already dead beyond resurrection, they began to understand the magnitude of their miscalculation. Brutus, standing in the forum where he had expected to be hailed as a liberator, found himself facing crowds that called him murderer rather than hero. The philosophical principles that had seemed so clear in private discussions became murky and complicated when confronted with the reality of what they had wrought. "We freed Rome from tyranny," he protested to citizens who seemed more interested in avenging Caesar than in celebrating their liberation. "We restored the republic, we upheld the law, we served the greater good." But the people who heard these words remembered a different Caesar, the man who had provided them with bread and circuses, who had extended citizenship to their provincial cousins, who had promised them a future brighter than any their ancestors had known. They did not feel liberated, they felt orphaned. In the months that followed, as civil war erupted once again, and the assassins discovered that killing Caesar had not killed Caesarism, the true scope of his achievement began to reveal itself. He had not simply conquered territories or accumulated power, he had fundamentally altered the way human beings thought about governance, citizenship, and the possibility of uniting diverse peoples under a single authority. The empire that Augustus would eventually establish, the institutions that would govern the Western world for the next 15 centuries, the very concept of universal citizenship that would eventually evolve into modern democracy, all had their roots in the vision that had died with Caesar on the Senate House floor, but had been reborn in the actions of those who sought to fulfill his legacy. When Augustus finally restored order and established the principate that would endure for centuries, he was careful to claim that he was restoring the republic rather than founding an empire. But everyone understood that what he was really doing was institutionalizing Caesar's innovations, creating permanent structures for the revolutionary changes that his adoptive father had implemented through personal authority alone. "I found Rome a city of brick," Augustus would later boast, "and left it a city of marble." But the transformation that truly mattered was not architectural. It was the metamorphosis from a city-state that ruled through military dominance to an empire that governed through the promise of participation, from a republic that served the interests of a small elite to a cosmopolitan state that offered advancement to anyone capable of earning it. The calendar that bears Caesar's name still governs the way we measure time. The title he made famous, Caesar, became the word for supreme authority in languages from German, Kaiser, to Russian, Tsar, to Arabic, Kaisar. The administrative systems he pioneered, the legal concepts he developed, the military tactics he perfected, the rhetorical techniques he mastered, all continued to influence human civilization long after their creator had crumbled to dust. But perhaps Caesar's most enduring legacy was not institutional but psychological, the proof he provided that individual human beings, if they possessed sufficient vision and determination, could reshape the world according to their will. Every subsequent conqueror, every revolutionary, every leader who dared to challenge the established order would measure themselves against the standard he had set. Napoleon, standing before his troops in the shadow of the pyramids, would invoke Caesar's memory to inspire his soldiers. Churchill, rallying Britain during its darkest hour, would quote Caesar's commentaries to explain the nature of leadership under pressure. Countless others in times and places Caesar could never have imagined would find in his example the courage to attempt what others deemed impossible. Even his assassins, in their misguided way, paid tribute to his greatness. They killed him not because he was weak or failing, but because he was so successful that they feared no one would ever be able to challenge his authority through conventional means. Their very act of desperation proved that they understood what his supporters knew. Caesar had transcended the ordinary limitations of political leadership and become something unprecedented in human history. In the end, the question is not whether Caesar was good or evil, liberator or tyrant, hero or villain. The question is whether human beings have the right to aspire to greatness that transcends the boundaries previous generations have accepted as immutable. Caesar believed they did, and he spent his life proving that belief through achievements that expanded the very definition of what was possible for mortals to accomplish. The boy who had once pressed his ear to the bronze doors of the Senate House, straining to hear the voices of power, had become the man whose voice would echo through history long after those doors had crumbled and the building they protected had fallen to ruin. He had dreamed of glory, and he had achieved immortality. Not the false immortality of marble statues and bronze inscriptions, but the true immortality of ideas that continue to shape the world long after their creator has departed from it. As night settles over the 7 hills where his story began, and the stars that witnessed his birth shine down on a world he helped to create, Julius Caesar sleeps the sleep of those who have fulfilled their destiny completely. The die was cast, the river was crossed, the IDs came and went, but the legacy endures, as eternal as the city he loved, as enduring as the human capacity for greatness, as immortal as the dreams that drove a curious child from the Subura to become the master of the world. In dreams, perhaps, he still walks the marble halls of Rome, still plans campaigns that will never be fought, still envisions a future where human beings have learned to govern themselves with the wisdom of philosophers and the courage of heroes. And in those dreams, the boy and the man and the legend become one. Eternal Caesar, forever young, forever reaching toward horizons that beckon like promises of glory yet to come. The dream fades, but the dreamer lives forever. And so ends our gentle journey through the life of Julius Caesar, from the narrow streets of the Subura to the marble halls of empire. Let his story carry you into peaceful sleep, where perhaps you too might dream of greatness, of courage, of the eternal human desire to reach beyond the boundaries that others accept as final. Rest well, and may your own dreams be filled with the kind of vision that transforms the world.